Texas was a land where law was thin and tempers were short. A place where a single insult, a single glance, could end with a body in the dust. These weren't just outlaws or lawmen. They were gunfighters, deadly men whose pistols carved the legend of the Wild West. The summer air in Missouri was heavy, almost too heavy to breathe. It pressed down on the small town square of Springfield as the crowd began to gather, men whispering to one another, women clutching their shawls and looking nervously toward the courthouse steps. There had been talk all day that something was coming, and in those times, when men walked with pistols hanging at their sides and honor meant more than law, talk like that often ended in blood. Two figures approached from opposite ends of the square. On the north side was Davis Tutt, a former Confederate soldier whose years of gambling had given him a reputation for quick temper and quicker wagers. He carried himself with the swagger of a man accustomed to risk, his coat brushing the handles of his pistol as though reminding the world of what he carried. Across from him, on the south side, stood James Butler Hickok, known already to some as Wild Bill. Tall, sharp-eyed, his long hair slicked back. He had the look of a man worn down by years of scouting and soldiering, but with enough fight left in him to handle whatever the world threw his way. Between them stretched 75 yards of dirt road and expectation. And in that space, in the late afternoon of July 21, 1865, the first gunfight of the post-Civil War frontier unfolded. The story of Hickok and Tutt has been told countless times, each version embroidered a little differently. But what mattered was not the size of the debt that sparked it or whether the quarrel had to do with a woman. What mattered was the principle of it. Tutt had seized Hickok's pocket watch over a gambling dispute. Hickok warned him not to wear that watch openly in the square. And when Tutt chose to do exactly that, both men knew it wasn't about a watch anymore. It was about honor. The crowd held its breath as the two squared their shoulders. Pistols flashed from leather, smoke bloomed, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. Tutt stumbled, a dark stain spreading across his chest, and fell dead before the courthouse. Hickok lowered his revolver, steady, unscathed, and coolly faced down Tutt's friends with a warning. "Put up your guns, or there'll be more dead men here." That single exchange, brief as a blink, carried farther than anyone in Springfield could have imagined. Newspapers picked it up, and soon the tale of Wild Bill Hickok's deadly accuracy spread across the country. This wasn't the first duel with pistols on American soil, not by a long shot, but something about the timing, the players, and the setting made it different. It was the first time Americans looked at such a contest and called it something new, something that would shape the mythology of a nation. A gunfight. And so, almost by accident, the age of the gunfighter was born. The United States in 1865 was in flux. The Civil War had ended only months before, leaving behind a landscape of burned farms, fractured families, and soldiers, Union and Confederate alike, who returned to a world they no longer recognized. Thousands of young men had grown accustomed to violence, hardened by years of killing, and suddenly found themselves with no battles left to fight. Some tried to build new lives on the frontier, where land was cheap and opportunity lay in the sweep of unsettled prairies. Others, rootless and restless, drifted toward vice. Gambling, drinking, and outlawry. The frontier itself was no less restless. Railroads were being laid, cattle drives were starting to thunder north from Texas, and towns like Abilene, Dodge City, and Tombstone would soon sprout into symbols of opportunity and danger alike. And in those towns, where law was often little more than the will of whoever carried the fastest gun, men like Hickok became both feared and celebrated. Yet Hickok was only the beginning. The gunfighter, as a figure of history and myth, was less about one man than about a culture that seemed to breed them. And nowhere was that culture more deeply rooted than in Texas. Texas in the mid-19th century was a land defined by conflict. For generations it had been a battleground between settlers and the Mexican army, between ranchers and Comanche raiding parties, between cattlemen and rustlers, and eventually between lawmen and outlaws who slipped across the border with impunity. To live in Texas was to live on the edge of violence. Children grew up with rifles leaning in the corner of the cabin and stories of raids whispered around campfires. Honor mattered more than written law, and personal justice was often delivered faster than any court could convene. When the revolver arrived, a weapon that allowed a man to fire multiple shots without reloading, it was embraced with an enthusiasm that changed not just Texas, but the entire West. The Texas Rangers, rough riders hardened by endless clashes with Comanche warriors, became the first to master these new weapons. In their hands, the Colt revolver was more than a tool. It was a revolution. For the first time, a small band of mounted men could match the speed and ferocity of the Comanche on open ground. Stories of Rangers charging headlong into battle, pistols blazing in both hands, spread like wildfire. And in those stories, the seed of the gunfighter myth was planted. The duel in Springfield may have captured the nation's imagination, but it was Texas that gave the archetype its form. Texans carried their sense of honor with a ferocity born of Southern tradition, where duels had once been a way for gentlemen to settle disputes. But on the frontier, the code of honor was less formal and far deadlier. A slight word, a crooked card, a stolen horse, any of these could end in a shootout. And because Texans carried their customs with them wherever they went, from Kansas cattle towns to Arizona mining camps, the shadow of the Lone Star seemed to hang over every violent tale the West would tell. What began as duels of honor evolved into spontaneous showdowns outside saloons, across dusty streets, or in crowded dance halls. And while newspapers back east often recoiled at the bloodshed, they also couldn't look away. Every headline, every lurid retelling, made these men larger than life. As the years stretched from Hickok's first gunfight toward the cattle boom and the rise of outlaws like Jesse James and Billy the Kid, the pattern repeated again and again. A land without law, men bound by honor, and revolvers that gave violence a sudden, theatrical quality. This combination created a figure who stood apart from ordinary criminals and common soldiers alike. He wasn't just a killer, he was a gunfighter. The duel in Springfield had been a spark, but sparks alone don't light an entire prairie. What turned a single shootout into a culture of gunfighting was something older, deeper, and more stubborn than any one man's quarrel: the Southern obsession with honor. In the antebellum South, a man's reputation was his wealth, his defense, his legacy. To call him a liar, to question his courage, to cast doubt on his fidelity could be as deadly as drawing steel. Formal duels with pistols or swords had long been the stage for settling such disputes. Andrew Jackson carried bullets in his body from his dueling days. Henry Clay and countless other statesmen had fired shots on misty mornings under the watch of seconds and surgeons. But by the mid-1800s, dueling in the North had fallen into disrepute. Clergymen railed against it, and legislatures outlawed it. In New England, honor was increasingly measured by virtue and industriousness, not the willingness to risk life at dawn with a pistol. The South, and especially Texas, was different. Migrants from Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia carried with them a fierce attachment to personal reputation. They may not have always followed the elaborate rules of the Code Duello, but the spirit was the same. When challenged, a man had to respond. And when Texans carried that tradition westward, it collided with the vast, law-thin frontier. Without reliable courts or sheriffs to mediate, the answer was usually a gun. So when a gambler like Hickok told a rival not to cross the square with his watch, or when a cowboy in Dodge City warned another to watch his words, they were not simply bickering. They were invoking a tradition that said some insults could only be answered with blood. Texas was the crucible where these customs hardened into something unique. It was a land forged in rebellion, first against Mexico, then against the Comanche who dominated its plains. Violence wasn't an occasional misfortune in Texas. It was the texture of life. Families built cabins with loopholes in the walls for firing rifles during raids. Travelers rode armed, expecting that any turn in the trail might reveal bandits or warriors. And the very economy, first cotton, then cattle, encouraged a martial spirit. Cattle had to be defended from rustlers, herds driven hundreds of miles across hostile land, and range disputes settled with bullets more often than contracts. The Texas Rangers embodied this world. By the 1840s, they were already feared for their ability to move fast, fight hard, and shoot straight. Their embrace of the Colt revolver was no accident. They needed a weapon as relentless as the world they patrolled. Against Comanche horsemen, the revolver proved decisive. A ranger could fire 6 shots in quick succession, reload with another cylinder, and keep firing long after a single-shot musket would have been useless. From that moment forward, Texans and 6-shooters became inseparable in the American imagination. But it wasn't just the weapon, it was the way Texans used it. They fought in small, mobile bands, relying on individual courage and split-second decisions. There was no time for the formalities of dueling grounds or letters of challenge. Insults were met with fists or pistols on the spot. This immediacy, born of frontier necessity, gave rise to the spontaneous gunfight. 2 men squaring off in the middle of a street, weapons flashing, bystanders scattering. When Texans left their home state to drive cattle north after the Civil War, they carried this reputation with them. Cattle towns like Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita soon learned what it meant when herds of young cowboys, armed and restless, poured into saloons after months on the trail. Whiskey flowed, cards slapped onto tables, and insults flew. Inevitably, guns followed. The locals blamed the Texans for the violence, and not without reason. Kansas newspapers printed editorials lamenting the arrival of Texas hellions, who seemed to treat every argument as a prelude to a duel. And though not every fight ended in gunfire, enough did that the association stuck. To the people of the frontier, a Texan with a 6-shooter was a storm waiting to break. This reputation wasn't confined to nameless drovers. Some of the most notorious gunfighters of the era, men like John Wesley Hardin, Clay Allison, and Ben Thompson, were Texans. Each carried the blend of charm and menace that made the archetype unforgettable. Hardin claimed to have killed dozens before he was 21. Allison, known for his wild temper, once supposedly shot a man for snoring too loudly. Thompson, a gambler turned lawman, carried himself with the icy confidence of a man who had stared death down too many times to flinch. And then, of course, there was Hickok. Though not a Texan by birth, his legend grew in tandem with theirs. When he served as marshal in Abilene, he faced the rowdy Texas cowboys head-on, walking the dusty streets with twin Colt Navy revolvers strapped to his hips, handles forward for a faster draw. His confrontations, some real, some exaggerated, cemented his reputation as the first great gunfighter of the West. But the men he faced, more often than not, hailed from Texas. The gunfighter was not just a product of violence, but of publicity. Newspapers craved stories of frontier justice, and tales of quick draws and deadly showdowns sold papers back east. A killing in Boston was a tragedy. A killing in Abilene was a saga. Writers seized upon the drama, painting these men as both villains and heroes, sometimes in the same breath. And as the stories grew, so too did the myth. By the 1870s, the image was fixed. The lone gunman standing tall, facing his enemy in the open street, revolver flashing in the sun. Reality was messier. Most gunfights were chaotic, fueled by liquor and fear, bullets flying in crowded rooms rather than empty streets. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Many veterans like Hickok insisted that the first man to shoot quickly often missed, while the one who took a steady aim survived. But myth thrives on simplicity, and the myth of the gunfighter was too compelling to be undone by facts. As the frontier pushed westward, the culture of the gunfighter traveled with it. Texans drifted into New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and beyond, bringing with them not just cattle, but the code of honor and the readiness to enforce it with lead. Wherever they went, violence followed, and with violence came fame. The Hickok-Tut duel may have been remembered as the first iconic gunfight, but it was really just the opening act. What was coming was bigger. The rise of Billy the Kid in New Mexico, the bloody feuds of Texas families, the legendary showdown at the OK Corral in Arizona, and the outlaw trails that stretched into Wyoming and Montana. All of it grew from the same roots: Southern honor, Texas violence, and the 6-shooter that made it possible. And so, as the sun set on that Missouri square where Hickok lowered his smoking revolver, a new era was dawning. An era where reputation was measured not just in words, but in how steady a man's hand was when the moment came. An era where the gunfighter, for better or worse, became the embodiment of the frontier itself. The war was over, but Texas didn't feel like peace. When Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, the men of Texas returned to a land still smoldering with conflict. Farms had been stripped bare, the Confederate currency in their pockets was worthless, and bitterness hung in the air like the dust of a cattle drive. Texas had been spared the worst battlefields of the war, but the wounds of defeat were no less deep. And unlike Virginia or Georgia, Texas was far from Union oversight. In those vast open plains and tangled river bottoms, there was no strong arm of federal authority to impose order. The collapse of the Confederacy left a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Outlaws, desperados, and restless ex-soldiers poured into the void. Some were bitter Confederates unwilling to accept defeat. Others were young men who had grown used to violence and found it difficult to lay down their guns. A few were simply opportunists, seeing in the chaos a chance to take what they wanted. Together, they created an atmosphere where every slight could escalate into gunfire, every quarrel into a vendetta. Reconstruction in Texas was unlike anywhere else in the South. The federal government's attempts to impose order met fierce resistance. Freedmen sought to exercise new rights, only to face intimidation and violence from neighbors who couldn't let go of the old order. Federal troops were stretched thin, posted in scattered forts, often powerless to police the countryside. Local sheriffs lacked manpower and often lacked the will. For every man wearing a badge, there seemed to be 10 ready to defy it. In this environment, violence was not an aberration, it was an expectation. Feuds sprouted like brush fires, sparked by old grievances or new insults. Families carried grudges across generations, sometimes sparked by something as small as a disputed fence line, sometimes by politics, sometimes by nothing more than a word spoken at the wrong time. And in the middle of it all were the pistols. Cheap, reliable revolvers had flooded into Texas after the war, and with them came the ability for a single argument to end with 2 bodies in the dust. Among the many restless young men drifting across Texas in these years was one whose name would soon be whispered with both fear and fascination: John Wesley Hardin. Born in 1853 near Bonham, Texas, Hardin grew up in a state already accustomed to bloodshed. His father was a preacher, his mother a woman of stern discipline, and by all accounts the boy was bright, quick to learn, and quicker to temper. Like many children of the frontier, he was introduced to firearms almost as soon as he could walk. By his early teens he could ride, rope, and shoot with the best of them. But the end of the Civil War coincided with Hardin's adolescence, and in that storm of chaos his life took a darker path. Hardin's first killing came when he was just 15. Accounts differ, as they often do, but most agree it began with a wrestling match between the teenager and a freed black man named Mage. What started as a contest escalated into a fight, and Hardin, claiming Mage had attacked him with a stick, drew a pistol and fired. The man fell dead. It was a shocking act for someone so young, but in the Texas of 1868 it was not unheard of. Reconstruction had inflamed racial tensions, and killings like this too often went unpunished. Hardin fled, first to relatives, then to the backcountry, but the incident set him on a path from which he would never return. From that point forward, John Wesley Hardin lived by the gun. What made Hardin different from other young men who carried pistols was not just his willingness to use them, but the sheer frequency with which he did so. By his own later boast, exaggerated, no doubt, but not entirely fiction, he killed more than 40 men. Whether that number was truth or legend hardly mattered. What mattered was that people believed it. And in a world where reputation could be as deadly as bullets, Hardin's name became a weapon all its own. He killed over gambling debts, over insults, over imagined slights. He killed lawmen sent to arrest him, and he killed fellow drifters who crossed his path. In one notorious story, he supposedly shot a man in a hotel room for snoring too loudly, though some historians suspect this tale was more legend than fact. Still, the image stuck, Hardin as the embodiment of reckless, senseless frontier violence. Yet even in the stories, one thing was clear. He killed not for money, not for politics, but for honor, his own twisted interpretation of it. If he felt slighted, he drew. If he thought someone might draw on him, he drew first. To Hardin, reputation was survival, and survival meant striking before the other man had the chance. As Hardin's body count grew, so did his legend. Texas newspapers began to print stories of the boy killer, and every tale made him more feared. To some, he was a villain, a monster whose life was a trail of corpses. To others, especially in communities that resented Reconstruction authorities, he was a kind of anti-hero, a figure who defied the lawmen sent by distant powers. But Hardin was not alone. Texas in these years was thick with men like him. Clay Allison, a wild-tempered cattleman who once danced naked through a saloon before pulling his revolver on anyone who laughed. Ben Thompson, a gambler with a cool head and a deadly aim. Cullen Baker, who terrorized northeast Texas with his gang of bushwhackers. And King Fisher, who would later command a band of gunmen along the Mexican border. Each of them was different, but all shared the same soil. Texas, in the years after the Civil War, when violence seemed less like a crime and more like a way of life. By 1870, the name Texas had become synonymous with gunplay. Eastern newspapers carried lurid stories of cowboys shooting up saloons, of desperados battling sheriffs in dusty streets, of families feuding until entire counties were soaked in blood. The myth of the wild Texan was already being written, and like most myths, it was born of truth. The statistics told the story. Texas accounted for more recorded gunfights than any other state in the West. More gunfighters were born there and more died there. To the rest of the frontier, Texans were the embodiment of the new archetype. Men who lived by the six-shooter, whose tempers were as quick as their draws. And in that storm, young John Wesley Hardin rose as the deadliest of them all. The Texas that raised John Wesley Hardin was more than a state. It was a crucible of violence. From Red River country to the Gulf Coast, men carried their pistols as naturally as their hats. It wasn't just outlaws who did the killing. Ordinary farmers, drovers, gamblers, and sheriffs found themselves locked in a culture where the difference between insult and death was sometimes no more than a heartbeat. Hardin thrived in that world. His killings came fast and frequent. At 17, while playing cards, he argued with a man who accused him of cheating. Voices rose, chairs scraped, and pistols appeared. The other man was dead before he could clear leather. Later, while traveling under assumed names, Hardin clashed with Union soldiers stationed in Texas. He claimed he shot several in skirmishes, escaping each time into the mesquite. Whether the numbers were true hardly mattered. The tales traveled ahead of him, building a legend darker than the reality could ever be. By the early 1870s, Hardin's name carried a weight all its own. To hear that John Wesley Hardin was in town was enough to empty saloons, or to fill them with men eager to witness his next outburst. Sometimes he slipped into gambling halls under aliases, only to be recognized when tempers flared and pistols came out. The young killer was always moving, never able to stay long in one place. But Hardin was not just the story of one violent youth. He was the symbol of an entire era. A Texas spinning out of control in the years after the Civil War. The cattle drives that carried herds north to Kansas brought thousands of young men into contact with liquor, cards, and women, and the results were predictable. Every trail town echoed with the sound of gunfire. Feuds raged across the countryside. Families with names like Sutton, Taylor, and Feud sprang into violence that could consume generations. A quarrel over cattle or politics could escalate into ambushes, lynchings, and midnight raids, leaving bodies in ditches and homesteads burned to the ground. In a state where law was weak and sheriffs outnumbered, people turned to vigilante justice. Posses formed to hunt rustlers or avenge killings, often blurring the line between justice and murder. It was in this atmosphere that Hardin came of age, a time when a boy could become a killer before he turned 16, and when killing could elevate a man's reputation as much as it damned him. Hardin himself seemed to live with one foot in myth. In his later autobiography, written from prison, he claimed a kill count so high it beggared belief. Some stories were clearly inflated, like the tale of him gunning down a man for snoring too loudly in a boarding house. Yet even if half his claims were false, the other half were terrifying enough. He ambushed Texas lawmen, fought shootouts in crowded saloons, and once killed 3 men who tried to corner him in a single brawl. Everywhere he went, he left a trail of fear. Newspapers picked up the stories, and the legend grew. Some called him a monster. Others whispered admiration for his defiance of Reconstruction authorities. The line between outlaw and folk hero blurred, as it so often did in the West. By 1871, the state of Texas had begun to push back. Governor Edmund J. Davis, a Republican determined to enforce law and order during Reconstruction, authorized the creation of a state police force. The Texas State Police, many of them former Unionists and freedmen, were tasked with hunting down outlaws like Hardin. But their presence inflamed tensions further. To many Texans, the state police represented outside authority, an unwanted arm of federal power. Every attempt to enforce order only seemed to breed more chaos. Hardin himself clashed with the state police more than once. He killed officers who tried to arrest him, then vanished into the backcountry. Each time he escaped, his reputation grew larger. To capture Hardin alive began to seem impossible. And all the while, Texas was living through a wider epidemic of blood. Vigilante mobs hung suspected rustlers from trees. Cowboys shot each other over card games. Entire families carried on feuds that turned counties into battlefields. The statistics of the time, fragmentary though they are, tell a chilling story. Texas accounted for more recorded gunfights than any other western state, by a wide margin. In towns like Abilene and Dodge City, Texas cowboys carried this culture northward. They swaggered into saloons, revolvers on their hips, bringing with them the reputation that Texans would shoot quicker than anyone else. It was these young men who clashed with lawmen like Wild Bill Hickok and later Wyatt Earp. And though not every cowboy became an outlaw, the image of the Texan as a natural gunfighter was cemented in the national imagination. Hardin, of course, stood at the center of it. By his early 20s, he had become the most feared name in Texas. His legend was not one of noble duels or stand-up street fights. It was a trail of sudden violence, of men gunned down in gambling halls and back alleys, of ambushes and escapes. He embodied the worst excesses of a culture where honor, violence, and survival were hopelessly entangled. The years from 1865 to 1871 would later be remembered as a cauldron, a time when Texas boiled over with lawlessness, when young men like John Wesley Hardin turned killing into a way of life, and when the archetype of the gunfighter began to take its final shape. The state was not yet tamed, not yet organized. It was a place where a boy could grow into a killer, where a family quarrel could ignite a war, and where the six-shooter ruled as judge and jury. Out of this chaos came not only Hardin, but a generation of gunfighters who carried the violence of Texas outward into the wider West. And as the 1870s dawned, the world beyond Texas was beginning to notice. The cattle drives were heading north, and with them came the Texans, restless, armed, and unafraid to shoot. Soon their reputation would spread across Kansas, New Mexico, and Arizona, until the name Texas itself was shorthand for trouble. But in these years, before the wider West took on the legend, it was Texas alone that carried the crown of violence. And no name captured it better than that of John Wesley Hardin. The boy killer, the deadliest son of Texas, and the embodiment of a state that had made the West truly wild. The trail north began with dust. In the spring of each year, when the grass grew high on the Texas plains, ranchers gathered their herds and pushed them northward. The war had left Texas rich in cattle but poor in buyers. Millions of longhorns roamed the open ranges, wild descendants of Spanish stock that had multiplied almost unchecked while the men of Texas fought in distant battles. They were tough, lean animals with sweeping horns, worth barely $1 a head in Texas but 10 times that in the meat-hungry cities of the north. The problem was distance. There were no railroads deep in Texas, only in Kansas. So the cattle had to be driven, hundreds of miles on hoof, through rivers and storms, across prairies alive with Comanche raiders and rustlers, until they reached the railheads. It was a journey of grit, exhaustion, and danger. But for the cowboys, most of them young Texans barely out of their teens, it was also a test of manhood. By 1870, the name Texas Cowboy carried a reputation. They were tough riders, crack shots, and rowdy as soon as they hit town. After months of dust and beans, the lure of whiskey, gambling, and women was irresistible. And when hundreds of them poured into a small Kansas town all at once, the results were explosive. Abilene was the first to feel it. In 1867, Joseph McCoy, an Illinois cattle dealer, built stockyards and pens near the railroad tracks in Abilene, Kansas. He advertised across Texas, promising a safe, profitable end to the long trail drives. The experiment worked. Within a year, thousands of Longhorns were arriving, and with them came the Texans. Abilene was a sleepy town of a few hundred souls before the cattle trade. Suddenly it was a boomtown, filled with saloons, gambling halls, dance houses, and brothels. Money flowed freely, but so did violence. Texans, flush with wages and unrestrained after months on the trail, drank hard, played harder, and fought over everything from poker pots to women to insults muttered under the breath. The townspeople, overwhelmed, needed order. And into this chaos stepped James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok. Hickok arrived in Abilene in 1871, already carrying the reputation of a gunfighter from his Springfield duel with Davis Tutt. Tall, striking, with his flowing hair and ever-present Colts. He was as much a showman as a lawman. But he understood something vital. The Texans respected boldness, not bureaucracy. To face down a drunken cowboy in the middle of a crowded saloon, Hickok didn't quote ordinances or wave papers. He put a revolver in plain sight and dared the man to test him. His first months were a storm of confrontations. Hickok disarmed drunks, broke up brawls, and, when pressed, shot with precision. He killed more than one man in Abilene, but always with the claim that he fired in the line of duty. To the townspeople, he was a savior. To the cowboys, he was a dangerous obstacle, respected, yes, but never entirely trusted. The balance was delicate. Hickok walked the boardwalks of Abilene with a gambler's poise, but he knew that at any moment a Texan with too much whiskey could decide to test the legend. It was not just Hickok. Other names began to surface in the cattle towns, men who would become fixtures of the gunfighter era. Ben Thompson, a gambler from Austin, Texas, drifted north with the cattle trade. Where Hickok was flamboyant, Thompson was cold and deliberate. He carried himself with the quiet assurance of a man who had killed before and expected to again. To sit at a poker table with Thompson was to understand that every coin tossed into the pot carried the shadow of a pistol on the hip. And then there were others. Bat Masterson, still young and learning the trade. Wyatt Earp, not yet the legend of Tombstone but a deputy cutting his teeth in Kansas. Gamblers like Luke Short and cowboys like Clay Allison. Each in their way was shaped by the cattle towns, where the flood of Texans forced lawmen and outlaws into constant collision. The cattle towns themselves became stages, almost theaters, where the drama of the gunfighter played out. Abilene, Wichita, and later Dodge City, all were small places that grew overnight into magnets for violence. They existed for one purpose: to funnel Texas beef into northern markets. But along the way, they became cauldrons of myth. Newspapers loved to describe the scenes. The dusty streets filled with bawling cattle, the cowboys riding in with pistols on their belts, the saloons where fortunes changed hands over cards, the sudden eruption of gunfire that sent patrons diving for cover. Every story added to the legend of the West, and at the center of those stories were the Texans and the men who tried to control them. Hickok's time in Abilene ended abruptly. In October 1871, during a saloon fight, he shot and killed a man, but one of his bullets struck and killed his own deputy, Mike Williams. The tragedy shook Hickok deeply. His confidence, never entirely steady, crumbled under the guilt. He left Abilene soon after, his career as a lawman effectively finished. But the image remained. Hickok standing tall against the Texans, revolvers in hand, a symbol of law facing lawlessness. Abilene had burned his legend into the national imagination. And when Abilene closed its doors to the cattle trade, the herd simply moved west, first to Wichita, then to Dodge City, carrying the culture of the gunfighter with them. When Abilene finally shut its gates to the Longhorns, the trail shifted west to Wichita. Wichita in the early 1870s was a raw settlement, little more than a scattering of wooden storefronts and muddy streets. But the railroad was there, and that meant opportunity. The cattle poured in, and with them came the Texans. Almost overnight, Wichita transformed into a carnival of noise and dust. Herds thundered down the streets. Saloons sprouted like weeds. Gambling halls, dance houses, and brothels opened their doors to the young drovers who stumbled in from the trail with jingling spurs and money to burn. For a time, Wichita embraced its rowdiness. The town fathers wanted the trade, and the trade meant tolerating the cowboys. Lawmen tried to maintain order, but order was a relative term. Fistfights, knifings, and pistol shots were as common as church bells back east. It was here that Wyatt Earp first cut his teeth as a peace officer. Still in his 20s, Earp was not yet the cold, legendary figure of Tombstone. In Wichita, he was just another deputy, tall, broad-shouldered, quick with his fists, and learning how to deal with Texans who didn't much care for law. He developed the reputation of a man who would wade into a barroom brawl barehanded, swinging his revolver like a club before firing a shot. Unlike Hickok, who carried himself with a gambler's flourish, Earp was pragmatic, almost businesslike. To him, violence was not drama, it was necessity. But if Wichita was loud, Dodge City was thunder. By 1876, the Long Trail had pushed even farther west. Dodge City, perched on the edge of the Buffalo Plains, became the new capital of the cattle trade. The timing was perfect and terrible. The buffalo hunters were at their peak, slaughtering herds by the millions, and Dodge catered to them as well as to the cowboys. The result was a frontier town like no other. A boiling mix of hunters, gamblers, prostitutes, cowboys, and outlaws, all packed into a few dusty blocks. Dodge City became the symbol of the Wild West. The very name carried menace. Eastern papers called it the wickedest little city in America, and they weren't far wrong. Saloon after saloon lined the streets, each blazing with kerosene lamps, filled with the sound of fiddle music, shuffling cards, and the constant clink of whiskey glasses. Outside, horses stamped and whinnied. Inside, men argued, cheated, and reached for their guns. Texans were everywhere. They swaggered into Dodge by the hundreds each season, their broad hats pulled low, pistols swinging at their sides. They brought their habits with them, hard drinking, hard gambling, quick tempers, and Dodge absorbed it all. To meet the storm, Dodge City hired lawmen with iron nerves. Bat Masterson, a cool-headed gambler turned sheriff, walked its streets with calm assurance. His younger brother Ed wore the marshal's badge before him, only to be gunned down by drunken cowboys. A death that hardened Bat's resolve. Wyatt Earp, drifting from Wichita, pinned on another star here, learning the craft of dealing with Texans who respected nothing but force. And then there was Luke Short, another Texan gambler whose friendships and feuds would later shape the destiny of Dodge. Short was dapper, deadly, and quick-tempered, equally at home at a poker table or in a gunfight. He fit Dodge City like a hand to a glove. Together, these men formed what would later be called the Dodge City Peace Commission, a brotherhood of lawmen, gamblers, and gunfighters who ruled the town with equal parts fear and charm. To cross them was to risk death. To side with them was to share in the legend. The Texans didn't always lose. For every cowboy who was disarmed and sent packing, another managed to get off a shot that scarred or killed a lawman. Dodge was not a morality play with clear heroes and villains. It was a roiling contest between men of violence, where the line between lawman and outlaw blurred with every drink poured and every card dealt. Yet out of Dodge City, the myth of the gunfighter reached its full stride. The image crystallized. A dusty street at sundown, two men facing each other, hands hovering over their pistols, the crowd holding its breath. In truth, most Dodge City gunfights were messy affairs, filled with confusion and stray bullets. But the myth thrived, and newspapers back east devoured it. Dime novelists turned Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and their companions into heroes, while painting the Texans they fought as villains. Reality was murkier, but myth seldom cares for nuance. By the end of the 1870s, Dodge City's reign as cattle capital began to wane, just as Abilene and Wichita had before. The cattle trail shifted once again, and Dodge slowly quieted. But its legacy endured. It had been the boiling pot in which the archetypes of the West were cooked, the lawman, the gambler, the outlaw, the cowboy, and at the center of all of it was the Texan. Everywhere they went, Abilene, Wichita, Dodge, the Texans left their mark. They brought their cattle, their guns, their tempers, and their code of honor. They shaped the culture of the cattle towns, forcing men like Hickok, Earp, and Masterson to rise in response. Without the Texans, there would have been no Dodge City legend, no Abilene gunfights, no Wichita saloon brawls worth printing in New York papers. The cattle trail might have been an economic lifeline, but culturally it was a fuse, and the Texans were the spark that kept it burning. As the 1870s gave way to the 1880s, the cattle towns faded, but the men they produced carried the legend forward. Wyatt Earp would find his way to Tombstone. Bat Masterson would trade his badge for the pen of a journalist. Ben Thompson and Luke Short would carve their reputations in Texas and beyond. And the nameless cowboys, the thousands of young Texans who drank, gambled, and fought their way through Kansas, would fade into memory, but not before leaving behind the reputation that Texas was the breeding ground of the gunfighter. The trail towns had been the stage. The Texans had been the actors, and the myth of the gunfighter, now fully formed, was ready to travel westward into the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona, where it would find its most famous chapters. By the time John Wesley Hardin turned 20, his reputation was already infamous. To some Texans, he was a boy who'd grown up too fast in a world where killing was as common as breathing. To others, he was a monster, a living curse who carried death in his wake. To Hardin himself, he was simply a man defending his honor in a land where honor was life itself. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Hardin's trail through Texas in the early 1870s read like a ledger written in blood. He was barely 16 when he first killed. By 17, he was wanted across several counties. By 19, he was already a fugitive so notorious that lawmen knew his name long before they ever saw his face. The killings came fast. Some were during poker games gone bad, when accusations of cheating spiraled into drawn guns. Others were ambushes when Hardin believed someone meant to kill him and decided to strike first. More than once, he shot his way out of the grasp of Texas lawmen, leaving sheriffs and deputies dead in the dust. He later claimed that by his 20th birthday he had killed 24 men. Historians doubt the number, but in Texas what mattered was not the accuracy of the count, but the terror of the reputation. A man who killed 3 could be feared. A man who boasted of killing 30 was untouchable. What drove Hardin? Some said it was sheer temper, that he was reckless, hot-headed, unable to let an insult pass. Others saw calculation, a cold instinct to strike before being struck. Hardin himself, writing years later from a prison cell, insisted it was about honor. "They tried to arrest me," he said. "They tried to kill me. I never shot a man that didn't need killing." That phrase, "needed killing," was the anthem of Hardin's Texas. It was a land where men believed justice could be meted out on the spot, without court or jury. A thief caught stealing cattle needed killing. A rival who pulled a gun needed killing. A card cheat, a drunken loudmouth, a deputy with a warrant. In Hardin's eyes, all could meet that standard. And in the chaos of Reconstruction Texas, who was left to say otherwise? Hardin was not alone in his violence. Texas in those years was a furnace of killings. Family feuds tore through counties, each ambush breeding another. Vigilantes hanged suspected rustlers from trees and left them as warnings along the roads. Bandits prowled the border, stealing cattle and slipping across into Mexico before posses could give chase. But Hardin was the face of it all. He was young, brash, articulate, and unafraid to boast. Every killing he committed, he made sure was known. Every time he escaped the law, his legend grew. And every time a newspaper printed his name, John Wesley Hardin became less a man and more a myth. In 1871, Hardin's notoriety leapt to another level when he boarded a train near Bryan, Texas. A group of Texas state police officers, knowing who he was, tried to arrest him. Hardin didn't hesitate. He opened fire in the cramped car, killing one officer and wounding others before leaping from the train and vanishing into the countryside. The boldness of it shocked even Texas. To kill lawmen in broad daylight, in front of witnesses on a train no less, it was as though Hardin had declared himself untouchable. The state police doubled their efforts, but each attempt to capture him ended the same way, with Hardin gone and more dead men left behind. By now, Hardin was the most wanted man in Texas. Yet somehow he seemed to live charmed. He drifted from county to county, gambling in saloons, riding in cattle drives, sometimes even visiting relatives under false names. Wherever he went, he left whispers. "Hardin's here." Hardin killed another man. Hardin slipped away again. As Hardin's legend grew, so too did the stories around him. Some true, some invented, all terrifying. The most infamous was the tale of the snoring man. Hardin, drunk and restless in a hotel room, was kept awake by a man snoring in the next bed. Annoyed, he fired a bullet through the wall. The man died instantly. The story spread like wildfire, cementing Hardin's reputation as a killer so cold that even a snore could earn a death sentence. Hardin himself later claimed the story was exaggerated, that he had fired a warning shot, not meant to kill. But the truth didn't matter. The legend of John Wesley Hardin was more powerful than fact. By 1872, Texas was boiling over. Hardin was wanted in nearly every county, and bounty hunters began to take notice. But chasing Hardin was a deadly gamble. Those who tried often ended up in shallow graves. Still, his luck could not last forever. The longer John Wesley Hardin stayed free, the more he believed himself destined never to be caught. That kind of arrogance was common among Texas gunmen of his generation. The frontier rewarded boldness. Hesitation meant death. And so Hardin carried on as if the law could never touch him, each killing another stone laid on the altar of his reputation. But by 1872 and 1873, his violence had reached a fever pitch. Hardin's name appeared in feuds across central Texas, sometimes as a participant, other times as a hired hand. His family itself became embroiled in quarrels that left fields soaked in blood. One feud with the outlaw Sutton clan saw Hardin accused of ambushing and gunning down several men. Another clash with lawmen in Comanche County ended with a deputy sheriff dead in the street, his revolver still in its holster. Each incident added another layer to the legend. Hardin as the young gunslinger who could not be stopped. Yet every legend comes with a price. By now, the Texas State Police and county sheriffs had devoted whole posses to catching him. Rangers joined in. 2 men who had fought Comanche warriors on horseback now turned their rifles on the boy killer. But time after time, Hardin slipped away. He changed horses, used friends and family to hide him, and vanished into the labyrinth of the Texas countryside. Each escape only strengthened the myth. Newspapers began to compare him to Jesse James in Missouri, another former Confederate who had turned outlaw. To Eastern readers, Hardin was proof that Texas was the true heart of the Wild West. To Texans themselves, he was both a nightmare and, for some, a symbol of defiance against Reconstruction authority. Hardin himself fed the myth with his flair for drama. He wrote letters to newspapers, insisting he killed only in self-defense. He sent word to acquaintances boasting of his escapes. In a land where literacy was rare and news traveled by word of mouth, such letters were gold. They kept his name alive in every saloon conversation and every campfire story. But fame made him reckless. One of his most daring acts came in 1873. While traveling with companions, Hardin was cornered by a sheriff's posse. Outnumbered and outgunned, he should have surrendered. Instead, he turned his revolvers loose. Shots cracked across the night, horses screamed, and when the smoke cleared, Hardin had killed several lawmen and slipped away once more. To some, this was the final proof that he was not just another gunman, he was a killing machine. No jail could hold him, no posse could corner him. To others, it was proof of his evil. A young man who had left behind any semblance of conscience, shooting his way through life without regard for who fell in his path. By 1874, the pressure was mounting. The Texas Rangers, reorganized after years of weakness, began a renewed campaign against outlaws. Led by hard men like Leander McNelly, the Rangers struck fear even into men like Hardin. McNelly's unit was relentless, willing to ride for days without rest, willing to bend the law as far as necessary to enforce it. Hardin dodged them for a time, but his circle was tightening. He was a man in his early 20s, already with more deaths to his name than most gunmen ever claimed in a lifetime, but each year brought more enemies, more posses, and fewer safe havens. And yet, even as his world closed in, the legend continued to grow. The people of Texas told stories of Hardin like they told stories of storms or fires, as if he were not entirely human, but a force of nature. Some said he could draw and fire faster than the eye could see. Others claimed he could shoot with uncanny accuracy from horseback at full gallop. Whether true or not, such stories fed the myth of the gunfighter as a new kind of frontier warrior. The lone man with the revolver, deadly, fearless, untamed. Hardin's Texas from 1868 to 1874 was not just the story of one outlaw. It was the story of a state convulsed by violence, a culture where pistols decided arguments and reputations meant more than law. Hardin was its most vivid example, young, reckless, merciless, but he was also its product. Without Texas, there could have been no Hardin. By the middle of the decade, even those who admired his defiance began to wonder how long he could run. His friends grew fewer, his enemies more determined. The boy killer was now a man, but his future was narrowing to one of two ends: the hangman's rope or a bullet in the street. Either way, John Wesley Hardin's name was already immortal. By the spring of 1871, the trail north from Texas had become a river of horns. The Chisholm Trail, stretching from the Brazos River country through Indian Territory into Kansas, thundered with longhorns. Herds of 1,000 or more slogged their way northward, driven by boys barely out of their teens, guided by trail bosses who knew every river crossing, every patch of grass, every danger that lurked along the way. It was grueling work. Months of dust storms, swollen rivers, and long nights guarding cattle from stampede wore men down to raw nerve and muscle. But the reward lay at the end of the trail. A Kansas town, where cattle could be sold and men could forget their hardship in whiskey, cards, and women. Abilene had been the first railhead, but by 1871 its citizens had grown weary of the Texans and their six-shooters. Joseph McCoy's great experiment in cattle marketing had made the town rich, but it had also drenched it in blood. The people of Abilene voted to close their gates, and the trail shifted west. Wichita welcomed them. Wichita in the early 70s was a boomtown in miniature. Wooden storefronts lined the streets, each painted in garish colors to draw the eye of weary cowboys. Dance halls blared fiddle tunes late into the night, gambling houses dealt cards until dawn, and saloons served whiskey cheap enough to start a brawl but never strong enough to end one. The Texans, wild from months on the trail, descended on the town like a storm. They rode their horses into saloons, fired pistols in the air, and treated the town as if it were a temporary playground built for their amusement. To them it was, within weeks they would be gone, driving the next herd north, leaving Wichita to pick up the pieces. The locals, overwhelmed, hired lawmen. Among them was a tall, lean deputy with cold gray eyes, Wyatt Earp. Earp was not yet the man of Tombstone. He was a young lawman learning his trade. But even then, his instincts were clear. He wasn't flamboyant like Wild Bill Hickok, nor reckless like John Wesley Hardin. He was calculated, deliberate, and unyielding. To Wyatt Earp, the law was not about theater, it was about control. He faced the Texans head-on. When drunken cowboys fired pistols into the night, Earp waded into the crowd with his revolver drawn, striking with the butt before firing a shot. He gained a reputation for toughness, the kind of man who wouldn't back down no matter how many Texans stood against him. And in Wichita, that reputation meant survival. For the cowboys, Wyatt Earp became both enemy and symbol. They didn't love him, but they respected him. He was one of the few men north of the Red River who could look a Texan in the eye and not flinch. But Wichita's reign was short. By the mid-1870s, the trail shifted again, and the name Dodge City entered the lexicon of fear. Dodge was everything Wichita had been and more. It sat on the edge of the Buffalo Plains, where hunters were already wiping out herds by the millions. Into this violent stew rode the Texans with their cattle. Dodge became a crossroads of killers, gamblers, prostitutes, and lawmen, each vying for space in a few cramped blocks. The saloons of Dodge City were infamous. The Long Branch, the Alhambra, the Occidental. Whiskey flowed like water, cards slapped onto tables, and revolvers gleamed under lamplight. Every night was a powder keg waiting for a spark. And into this came Bat Masterson. Bat Masterson was young, like Earp, but cut from a different cloth. Where Earp was cold and steady, Bat was charming, quick with a smile, and even quicker with a gun when necessary. He came to Dodge as a buffalo hunter and gambler, but soon found himself wearing a badge. His brother Ed served as marshal before him, only to be killed in the line of duty by drunken cowboys. Bat took up the star after Ed's death, carrying with him a personal vendetta against lawbreakers who thought they could challenge Dodge City's fragile order. Masterson's style was measured. He preferred to talk men down when possible, but when guns came out, his aim was deadly. He earned a reputation as one of the West's cool-headed gunfighters, a man who could handle violence without letting it unbalance him. Alongside him, Wyatt Earp drifted into Dodge from Wichita, pinning on another badge. Together, they formed the backbone of Dodge's defense against the Texans. And then there was Ben Thompson. Unlike Earp or Masterson, Thompson was not a lawman in those days. He was a gambler from Austin, a man who carried himself with icy confidence. Thompson didn't bluster or brag. He simply killed when the moment came. At the poker tables, he was calm, deliberate, almost polite. But when disputes arose, his hand was quicker than nearly any man alive. Thompson was a Texan through and through. He brought with him the reputation of Texas gunfighters, and in Dodge he added to it. His duels, whether in gambling halls or on the street, became legend. To many, he was the very embodiment of the gunfighter. Cool, fearless, and deadly accurate. By the late 1870s, Dodge City had become the crucible where all these reputations fused. Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Ben Thompson, Luke Short, Clay Allison, and dozens of nameless Texans clashed in saloons and streets. Each gunfight, whether messy or clean, added to the growing myth of the West. The Texans, drunk on freedom and whiskey, tested the limits of law. The lawmen, often gamblers and killers themselves, held the line with fists, pistols, and reputation. Together, they created the storybook image of the Wild West town, dusty streets, high noon showdowns, and the ever-present six-shooter. But reality was harsher. Most fights were not duels but chaotic brawls. Most killings were not between evenly matched opponents but drunken accidents or ambushes. Yet the myth, clean, dramatic, cinematic, was too powerful to resist. And in Dodge City, more than anywhere else, that myth was written in gun smoke. Texas had always been a land of violence, but in the years after the Civil War that violence became generational. Where the law was weak and courts too distant, families became their own enforcers. A quarrel between two men could grow into a vendetta between two households, then ignite into a war that drew in cousins, neighbors, and allies across entire counties. It wasn't just about land or cattle. It was about honor, that word which in Texas carried the weight of blood. And when honor demanded vengeance, the revolver was always close at hand. The most infamous of these feuds began in DeWitt County, a stretch of rolling prairie and river bottomland in South Texas. It was here that the Taylor-Sutton feud erupted, a conflict that would claim more than 30 lives and leave the county scarred for decades. The Taylors were an old Texas family, tough and proud, with a history of fighting in the Revolution against Mexico. The Suttons were newcomers, former Confederates who had sided with the Union during Reconstruction, a fact that already put them at odds with many of their neighbors. Add in disputes over cattle, land, and politics, and the two families were primed for war. It began, as these things often did, with a killing. In 1868, William Sutton, a young rancher, shot and killed a Taylor cousin in a quarrel over cattle. The Taylors swore vengeance, and within months blood had answered blood. From that point forward, every death demanded another. Ambushes became common. Men were shot from horseback, killed in saloons, gunned down on lonely roads. The feud consumed DeWitt County. Families took sides. Posses rode out at night. The courts, powerless, became little more than spectators. To live in the county was to live under constant threat. A wrong word in the wrong saloon could mark a man for death. And through it all, the pistols barked. The Colt revolver made vengeance swift, personal, and final. By the early 1870s, the feud had escalated beyond anyone's control. William Sutton himself was ambushed and killed by the Taylors, shot down in broad daylight in Indianola. His death did not end the feud. It inflamed it. The Suttons struck back with equal fury. Bodies piled up until the name DeWitt County became synonymous with violence. Newspapers called it the Texas Vendetta. To outsiders, it seemed medieval, whole families slaughtering one another in the name of pride. To Texans, it was tragically familiar. The code of honor demanded blood, and once that cycle began, it rarely ended without generations buried. Elsewhere, another feud boiled over in Lampasas County. This was the Horrell-Higgins feud, and it was no less bloody. The Horrell brothers were notorious long before the feud began. A wild clan of Texans known for hard drinking, hard fighting, and quick tempers. The Higgins family, ranchers and stockmen, stood on the other side. The conflict began over cattle theft and accusations of rustling, but soon widened into politics and personal grudges. Gunfire erupted in the streets of Lampasas as Horrells and Higginses clashed. Saloons became battlegrounds. Ambushes claimed men on lonely trails. At one point, the Texas Rangers themselves were drawn into the conflict, siding with the Higginses and bringing the full weight of the state down on the Horrells. The Rangers' intervention was brutal. Several Horrell brothers were hunted down and killed. The feud sputtered on for years, leaving Lampasas haunted by its memory, but the Higginses emerged standing. These feuds were not just isolated eruptions of hatred. They were woven into the fabric of Texas life. In counties across the state, families carried grudges that outlived the men who first sparked them. Some began with cattle, others with politics, others still with nothing more than a drunken insult. But all followed the same path. A killing, a vow of vengeance, a spiral of blood. And in each case, the six-shooter turned words into corpses. To the outside world, these feuds became proof of Texas's reputation as the most violent corner of the West. Dime novelists embellished them, painting pictures of wild clans locked in endless duels. Newspapers back east described Texas as a state ruled not by courts but by pistols. And while exaggeration played its part, the truth was grim enough. Entire communities were dragged into wars they hadn't started, living in fear that tomorrow's sunrise might bring gunfire at their door. At the center of it all was the culture of honor. Texans believed deeply in defending reputation. To ignore an insult was to invite weakness. To fail to avenge a killing was to dishonor the dead. This belief, born of Southern tradition and hardened on the frontier, kept the feuds alive long after reason should have ended them. It was the same culture that produced John Wesley Hardin, Ben Thompson, and dozens of other gunfighters. They were individuals, yes, but they were also products of a society that saw violence not just as inevitable, but as righteous. The Taylor-Sutton feud reached its peak in the early 1870s. By then, both families were so entangled in violence that peace seemed impossible. Entire branches of kin had been drawn in, cousins who might never have met one another except on opposite sides of a gun barrel. The countryside lived in fear. Farmers avoided traveling alone, ranchers rode armed, and saloons became traps where ambushes played out in seconds. Rumors of the next killing kept townspeople awake at night. In 1874, William Sutton himself met his fate. He and several companions were preparing to leave Indianola, hoping perhaps to escape the bloodbath, when the Taylors struck. They ambushed Sutton in broad daylight, cutting him down before he had a chance to reach safety. His death was a thunderclap across Texas. The man whose name had ignited the feud was gone, but instead of ending the war, his killing deepened it. The Suttons retaliated with equal fury. They ambushed Taylors in turn, hunted them across counties, and left bodies in their wake. DeWitt County became a no-man's land, where lawmen feared to tread and civilians paid with their lives for being born into the wrong family. The state could no longer ignore it. By the mid-1870s, the Texas Rangers were called in to quell the violence. The Rangers who rode into DeWitt County were not diplomats. They were hard men, veterans of frontier fighting, used to dealing with Comanche raiders and Mexican bandits. Against the Taylors and Suttons, they brought the same ruthless efficiency. They patrolled the county, arrested gunmen on sight, and weren't above firing first if a man so much as twitched toward his belt. The show of force worked. The feud, exhausted by years of killings and pressed by Ranger intervention, slowly sputtered out. But by then more than 30 men were dead, and the memory of the bloodletting had seared itself into Texas history. In Lampasas County, the Horrell-Higgins feud followed a similar arc. though with its own peculiar brutality. The Horrell brothers were already notorious for their reckless ways. Their opponents, the Higgins family, were no saints either. What began as accusations of cattle theft soon escalated into a storm of ambushes and shootouts. One of the most violent clashes came in the town of Lampasas itself. Higgins partisans cornered several Horrell supporters in a saloon, and when the smoke cleared, for men lay dead. The streets ran with blood, and the town's reputation for violence spread across the state. The Texas Rangers again stepped in, siding with the Higginses. Their intervention was decisive. Several Horrells were killed outright, and the survivors scattered, their power broken. As with DeWitt County, peace returned not through reconciliation but through exhaustion and the relentless pressure of the Rangers' guns. These feuds were not isolated incidents. Across Texas, smaller vendettas flared, neighbors clashing over cattle, water rights, or politics, only for the quarrels to spill into blood that demanded repayment. In many ways, they were echoes of the Civil War itself, a conflict that had set brother against brother and left Texans accustomed to answering grievance with gunfire. To outsiders, these feuds confirmed every fear about Texas. Newspapers in New York and Chicago wrote with horror of a state where families exterminated each other in running wars. Dime novels turned them into melodrama, painting Texas as a place where the six-shooter replaced the Bible as the book of law. For Texans themselves, the feuds were shame and legend at once. They mourned the dead, yet they also told the stories of ambushes in the mesquite, of duels in saloons, of Rangers riding hard into the fray as part of the state's identity. The gunfighter myth found fertile soil in these vendettas. A feud required men willing to fight, and the six-shooter gave those men a weapon perfectly suited for sudden, violent encounters. Out of the Taylor, Sutton, and Horrell Higgins feuds came gunmen whose reputations would echo far beyond their counties. Some survived to become outlaws, others to join the ranks of Rangers or lawmen themselves. But the larger lesson was clear. Texas was a state where law was fragile, honor unyielding, and violence inevitable. The family feud, in all its bloody persistence, was proof that the gunfighter was not an isolated figure. He was the product of a culture that normalized killing as a way to settle disputes. By the late 1870s, as the cattle towns of Kansas reached their peak, the feuds of Texas began to fade. The Rangers, reorganized and determined, cracked down with increasing effectiveness. Railroads and courts brought a measure of order. Yet the memory of those bloody decades remained. To the rest of America, Texas was now fixed in the imagination as the birthplace of the gunfighter. And in truth, it was. The feuds of the 1870s had shown the world that no other state produced so many men willing to reach for their revolvers, or so many tales of blood spilled in the name of honor. By the mid-1870s, Texas stood on the edge of collapse. The Civil War had left scars that refused to heal. Feuds ripped apart counties. Desperados roamed with impunity. Cattle thieves cut herds from the open range, and outlaws like John Wesley Hardin left a trail of corpses behind them. Local sheriffs, often outnumbered and outgunned, could do little more than watch. Federal troops were stretched thin, stationed at distant forts with orders that meant little to the men who lived and died by their pistols. It was clear that Texas needed something more than scattered lawmen and desperate posses. It needed a force as hard as the land itself. Men who could fight like the Comanche, ride like the cowboys, and shoot as straight as the most notorious gunfighter. That force was the Texas Rangers. The Rangers had been around for decades, dating back to the 1830s, when Stephen F. Austin first authorized settlers to form mounted patrols against Comanche raiders. They had fought in the Texas Revolution, ridden against Mexico, and carved their reputation in the endless wars along the frontier. But after the Civil War, the Rangers had nearly vanished. Disbanded, reorganized, and neglected, they were little more than a memory while Texas bled. Then came Leander McNelly. McNelly was a small man, wiry and sickly from tuberculosis, but his toughness was legendary. In 1875, Governor Richard Koch authorized him to lead a new unit of Rangers, the Special Force, tasked with bringing order to South Texas. Their mission, break the power of the cattle thieves and cross-border raiders who had turned the Rio Grande country into a lawless no-man's land. McNally's methods were as uncompromising as the land he patrolled. He drilled his rangers into a tight unit, demanding discipline rare on the frontier. They rode fast, carried Colt revolvers and Winchester rifles, and wasted no time with legal formalities. When they found stolen cattle, they seized them. When they caught thieves, they shot them. His philosophy was simple. The law of Texas was to be enforced at the muzzle of a gun. One of McNally's most famous campaigns came against cattle thieves along the Nueces Strip, a stretch of scrubland between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. For years, Mexican raiders and Anglo rustlers alike had driven stolen herds across the border, laughing at Texas lawmen who dared not pursue them into Mexico. McNally changed that. He led his rangers across the river, ignoring international boundaries. In one raid, he seized stolen cattle right out of Mexican corrals and drove them back into Texas. When confronted by Mexican authorities, McNally bluffed with sheer audacity, threatening to open fire if they interfered. They didn't. His men, vastly outnumbered, rode away with the cattle and their reputations cemented. Stories of McNally's ruthlessness spread quickly. Once, when his rangers captured a band of rustlers, he lined them up and demanded confessions. Those who refused to talk were shot on the spot. Others were whipped, hanged, or accidentally killed while trying to escape. McNally rarely bothered with jails or courts. To him, law was not parchment and procedure. It was the authority of Texas, carried on horseback and enforced with six-shooters. Critics called him a murderer. Admirers called him a savior. But no one denied his effectiveness. By 1876, cattle theft along the border had plummeted. The mere rumor that McNally's rangers were in the area was often enough to scatter gangs who had terrorized the region for years. But McNally was only one part of the rangers' resurgence. Elsewhere in Texas, companies of rangers were reorganized to combat feuds and gunfighters. They rode into counties where sheriffs had been reduced to little more than figureheads and imposed order with the same ruthless efficiency. In DeWitt County, they broke the back of the Taylor-Sutton feud. In Lampasas, they crushed the Horrells. Wherever they went, the message was the same. The days of unchecked violence were ending. The Rangers didn't eliminate the gunfighter, but they changed the balance. For the first time, killers like Hardin found themselves hunted by men as skilled and fearless as they were. In 1877, McNally's health finally gave out. Tuberculosis consumed him, and he died young, his body broken but his legend intact. To the people of South Texas, his name lived on as the man who had dared to bring order where none had existed. To future Rangers, he became a model proof that discipline, audacity, and sheer will could tame even the wildest frontier. The Texas Rangers, revitalized by men like McNally, would go on to play a central role in the West's bloody theater. They fought outlaws, pursued desperados, and stood at the center of nearly every major gunfight and feud that shaped the Lone Star State. They were not saints. Their methods were often brutal, their justice extrajudicial. But in a land drowning in blood, they were a force strong enough to hold the line. By the late 1870s, Texas was changing. The worst feuds were winding down, the cattle drives were shifting west, and railroads were bringing courts, sheriffs, and judges into places that had once known only six-shooters. But the Rangers ensured that the gunfighters' reign would not be absolute. Still, their presence only added to the myth. For if the outlaw represented defiance, and the lawman represented order, the Texas Ranger was something in between. A figure both feared and admired, ruthless and heroic, who embodied the very contradictions of the frontier. And in the years to come, the Rangers would cross paths with nearly every legendary gunfighter of the age. The frontier did not end at the Red River. By the mid-1870s, Texas cattlemen were pushing westward, driving herds into the open ranges of New Mexico. The land was wide, fertile, and rich with promise, but also unstable, a place where law was thin and power belonged to those bold enough to seize it. In this contested space, the Texans found kindred spirits. Irish immigrants, Mexican ranchers, and Anglo settlers, all clawing for control. The result was a war without battlefields, a conflict that would produce one of the most enduring names of the gunfighter era. Billy the Kid. Lincoln County, New Mexico, in the late 1870s was a powder keg. On one side stood Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, Irish merchants who had built a monopoly over trade in the region. They controlled the only major store, dominated the local politics, and held the loyalty of the sheriff. To do business in Lincoln County, one went through Murphy and Dolan, or one didn't do business at all. On the other side rose John Tunstall, a young English rancher and merchant backed by Alexander McSween, a lawyer with ambition to match his partners. They opened a competing store, challenging the monopoly. To Murphy and Dolan, this was rebellion. To Tunstall and McSween, it was opportunity. To the men caught in between, it was the start of a war. It was in this cauldron that Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarty, later known also as William Bonney, found his place. Billy had drifted west from New York through Kansas and Arizona, a wiry orphan with a quick smile and quicker hands. By his teens he had already killed, though accounts differ as to how many and why. What no one disputed was his skill with a revolver and his almost uncanny ability to escape capture. When John Tunstall hired Billy as a ranch hand, he gained not just a cowboy but a gunman fiercely loyal to his employer. Tunstall treated Billy with respect, something the young drifter had rarely known. When Tunstall was murdered by a posse loyal to Murphy and Dolan in 1878, Billy's grief turned to rage. The Lincoln County War had begun. Billy and his fellow Avengers, who came to be known as the Regulators, swore vengeance. They included a number of Texans, young men cut from the same cloth as John Wesley Hardin, raised in the culture of honor and violence that made killing a matter of pride. They knew the code of the feud, and Lincoln County suited them well. The war quickly spiraled into a cycle of assassination and ambush. The Regulators hunted down the men who had killed Tunstall and shot them in cold blood. Murphy and Dolan's supporters struck back, gunning down Regulators in turn. Ranches burned, saloons became battlegrounds, and the streets of Lincoln echoed with gunfire. At the center of it all was Billy the Kid. Billy became the face of the Regulators not because he was the oldest, he was barely in his 20s, but because he was the boldest. He rode openly, laughed in the face of danger, and killed without hesitation. Stories spread of his lightning-fast draw, his boyish grin, and his uncanny ability to slip from the noose of capture. One famous tale told of Billy killing a man in the middle of a crowded street, then vanishing before the sheriff's posse could even organize. Another recounted his escape from jail, where he killed 2 deputies with his own handcuffs still rattling on his wrists. Whether truth or exaggeration, each story fed his legend. Billy the Kid was becoming what John Wesley Hardin had been in Texas, a symbol of the frontier's refusal to be tamed. The killing of John Tunstall in February 1878 lit the fuse, but it was the summer of that year that set Lincoln County ablaze. The Regulators, led in part by Billy the Kid, waged open war against the forces of Murphy and Dolan. They stalked the backroads, ambushing men loyal to the monopoly, gunning them down with the cold precision of frontier justice. For every bullet fired, a new target emerged. Revenge bred revenge, and soon the entire county was at war. The violence came to a head in July, during what would later be called the 5-Day Battle of Lincoln. Lincoln was a small town, a scattering of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts along a dusty street. But in July 1878 it became a war zone. On one side, Sheriff George Pepin, loyal to the Murphy-Dolan faction, gathered dozens of armed men. On the other side, the Regulators barricaded themselves inside McSween's house and nearby buildings, determined to make their stand. The two forces exchanged fire across the town for days. Bullets punched through adobe walls. Smoke curled over rooftops. Civilians huddled in cellars as stray rounds tore through their homes. The standoff dragged on until reinforcements, more than 40 men loyal to Dolan, set fire to McSween's house. Inside, Billy the Kid and a handful of Regulators prepared for death. The flames roared, the smoke thickened, and outside, Pepin's men waited with rifles leveled. As the house collapsed around them, Billy burst through the smoke, revolvers in hand, cutting down several gunmen in the street. Against all odds, he escaped. McSween was not so lucky. He was gunned down as he fled the burning building, his dream of breaking the monopoly buried with him. The 5-day battle ended with the Murphy-Dolan faction in control, but it made Billy the Kid a legend. After Lincoln, Billy lived as an outlaw full-time. The war had burned away any pretense of legitimacy. The young cowboy became a fugitive, riding with a small band of loyal followers. They rustled cattle, robbed when they needed to, and killed when cornered. To some, Billy was a criminal. To others, especially the Hispanics of New Mexico who admired his defiance against the Murphy-Dolan faction, he was a hero, El Chivato, the little goat who refused to bow. His charisma was undeniable. Unlike Hardin, whose violence seemed senseless and cruel, Billy carried himself with a kind of reckless charm. He was polite to women, quick with a joke, and loyal to his friends. Even some of his enemies admitted he had a strange magnetism. But behind the grin lay a revolver, and behind the revolver, a growing tally of the dead. By 1880, the law had found its champion in Pat Garrett, a tall, serious man elected sheriff of Lincoln County. Garrett had once known Billy, even drunk with him in saloons, but now he wore the badge and carried the weight of ending the Outlaws' run. The hunt became a duel of reputations. Garrett tracked Billy across the scrub and hills, always just behind, while the Kid slipped through canyons and hid in adobe ranches. When Garrett finally captured him in December 1880, the newspapers trumpeted it as the end of an era. Billy was sentenced to hang. But Billy the Kid was not finished. In April 1881, while awaiting execution in Lincoln, Billy pulled off his greatest escape. Locked in the courthouse, guarded by 2 deputies, he asked to use the outhouse. On the way back, he seized an opportunity. Some say he slipped a handcuff, others that he wrestled a revolver free. Within seconds, both deputies were dead. Billy shot one in the face, then gunned down the other with a rifle. He commandeered a horse, waved to the stunned townspeople, and rode out of Lincoln laughing. The story electrified the country. Newspapers called it miraculous, daring, unbelievable. Billy the Kid was no longer just a fugitive. He was an American Robin Hood, an outlaw who defied death and the law with equal ease. But even legends run out of luck. In July 1881, Garrett tracked Billy to Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Under the cover of night, he entered a darkened room where the Kid was rumored to be hiding. Billy, perhaps sensing something, stepped in barefoot, revolver in hand, whispering in Spanish, "¿Quién es? Who is it?" Garrett fired. The bullet struck Billy in the chest. He collapsed, dead before he hit the floor. Just like that, the boy who had cheated death a dozen times was gone. Not with a blaze of glory, but with a single shot in the dark. Yet death did not end the legend. If anything, it magnified it. Newspapers across America carried the story. Dime novels turned him into a larger-than-life figure, equal parts hero and villain. Some claimed Garrett had shot the wrong man. Others swore Billy survived and lived in hiding under other names. For decades, imposters would come forward, insisting they were the Kid. But whether dead or alive, Billy had achieved what few gunfighters ever did: immortality. He was remembered not just as a killer, but as a symbol, the reckless youth who laughed at the law, the outlaw who lived fast and died young, the boy who became the eternal face of the Wild West. The Lincoln County War was, in truth, little more than a sordid mercantile feud between rival storekeepers. But in the furnace of New Mexico's frontier, with Texans and drifters bringing their pistols and their pride, it became myth. And at the center of that myth stood Billy the Kid, proof that the age of the gunfighter was not confined to Texas, but had spread, shaping the imagination of an entire nation. The end of the Civil War did not bring peace to Missouri. Like Texas, it was a land scarred by bitterness, where guerrilla bands and bushwhackers refused to lay down their arms. Out of this soil rose a name that would haunt the frontier: Jesse James. Jesse was no ordinary outlaw. He was born in 1847 to a farming family, raised in a world where slavery, secession, and rebellion defined identity. As a teenager, he joined Confederate guerrillas under William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson. There he learned the trade of irregular war, ambush, assassination, terror. By the war's end, Jesse and his older brother Frank had killed as soldiers and as bushwhackers, and they carried those lessons into peacetime. But Missouri in 1865 had little forgiveness for men like them. Reconstruction authorities branded them traitors. Neighbors whispered their names with suspicion. The war was over, but Jesse James was not done fighting. He simply chose a new battlefield. In 1866, Jesse and Frank James joined with fellow ex-Confederates Cole and Jim Younger to rob a bank in Liberty, Missouri. It was one of the first daylight bank robberies in American history. The outlaws stormed in, pistols drawn, and rode away with thousands. The robbery shocked the nation. Here were not nameless bandits lurking in shadows, but former soldiers, proud and defiant, carrying out raids in broad daylight. The James Younger Gang was born. Over the next decade, the gang became the most notorious band of outlaws in the West. They robbed banks in Missouri, Iowa, and Kentucky. They held up stagecoaches, ambushed payroll wagons, and eventually turned their pistols on the railroads themselves. Train robberies, once thought impossible, became their trademark. Jesse James relished the theater of it. He wrote letters to newspapers, justifying his actions as rebellion against corrupt Reconstruction governments and wealthy corporations. Sympathetic editors published them, casting Jesse as a modern Robin Hood, though in truth he kept the money for himself and his men. But myth was stronger than fact. To poor farmers, Jesse James became a symbol of defiance, a man who stood against banks and railroads that they believed had enslaved them with debt. Texas was never far from the gang's story. Many of Jesse's men had roots in the Lone Star State or fled there when the law grew hot. Texas offered refuge, wide-open country, and sympathetic communities where ex-Confederates were still treated as heroes. The gang found allies among Texas ranchers and gunmen, men who understood the code of loyalty and vengeance that drove them. In return, Texans brought their own brand of violence to Jesse's world. Figures like Jim Cummins and Bill Chadwell, with Texas ties, rode with the gang at times. More importantly, the Texans brought their culture of the six-shooter, the same culture that had raised Hardin and the Sutton-Taylor feud, and fused it with Jesse's guerrilla style. The result was something new. The outlaw gunfighter, a figure who robbed trains by night, but also stood ready for street duels by day. The gang's fame reached its peak in 1876, when they attempted to rob the First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota. It was bold even by their standards. The outlaws rode into town in broad daylight, pistols ready, demanding money. But the citizens of Northfield were not cowed. Armed with rifles and shotguns, they fought back. Bullets tore through the streets. Several gang members fell dead. The younger brothers were captured, badly wounded. Jesse and Frank barely escaped with their lives, riding south through the wilderness with posses on their heels. The Northfield raid marked the end of the gang as a unified force. The Youngers went to prison, and Jesse was left to rebuild with new recruits. Yet even in defeat, the legend grew. Newspapers across the country painted Jesse as a fearless rebel. Children whispered his name as though he were a folk hero. But legends cannot outrun reality forever. By the early 1880s, Jesse James was living under an assumed name in St. Joseph, Missouri. He tried to live quietly, but he could not resist planning new robberies. Distrust grew within his gang. In April 1882, one of his own men, Robert Ford, betrayed him. While Jesse adjusted a picture on the wall, Ford shot him in the back of the head. The outlaw who had survived the Civil War, countless posses, and the Northfield disaster died in his own home, killed not in a gunfight but by treachery. And yet, like Billy the Kid, Jesse James became larger in death than in life. Dime novelists rushed to print his exploits. Newspapers painted him as both villain and martyr. Southerners who still hated Reconstruction turned him into a folk hero. His robberies became tales of daring, his murders explained away as justice. In reality, he was no Robin Hood. He killed for money and vengeance. But myth reshaped him into an icon. The death of Jesse James in 1882 was meant to be an ending. To the law, it was justice served. To his enemies, it was relief. But to the public, it was only the beginning of a legend. Within days, dime novel publishers had Jesse's story on the shelves. Titles blared his name: The Death of Jesse James, the Outlaw King, Life and Adventures of the Notorious Jesse James. They painted him not as a thief but as a romantic avenger. A man who stood against banks, railroads, and corrupt politicians. The fact that Jesse had never shared his loot with the poor didn't matter. Myth had claimed him, and in that myth, Jesse James became something new. Not just an outlaw but a gunfighter outlaw. This was the crucial shift. Earlier gunfighters, Hickok, Hardin, Thompson, fought over insults, cards, or cattle. Their reputations came from street duels and saloon shootouts. Outlaws, by contrast, were bandits who robbed and ran. Jesse James fused the two. He was a bushwhacker turned bank robber who also carried the aura of the gunfighter, willing to stand and fight in the open. In doing so, he merged two archetypes into one: the gunslinger who could rob a train at midnight and then face down an enemy in the street by noon. Texas helped carry that fusion forward. In the late 1870s and early 1880s, young Texans began to imitate Jesse's example. One of the most famous was Sam Bass, a drifter who led a gang that robbed stagecoaches and trains across Texas. Bass was no hardened guerrilla like Jesse. He was more a gambler turned bandit. But his exploits, bold, theatrical, and bloody, made him a folk hero in Texas just as Jesse had been in Missouri. Bass's most famous robbery came in 1878, when his gang held up a train near Big Spring, Texas, and escaped with tens of thousands in gold coins, one of the largest hauls of the era. For a brief moment, Bass seemed untouchable. Texans sang ballads about him, praising his daring. But like Jesse, Bass's end came quickly. The Texas Rangers tracked him down, ambushing his gang near Round Rock. Bass was mortally wounded and died at the age of 27, sealing his place in outlaw folklore. The line between outlaw and gunfighter was now blurred beyond recognition. A man could be remembered for robbing a train, shooting a sheriff, or dueling in a saloon. It no longer mattered. What mattered was reputation, the ability to project an image of fearless defiance. Dime novels fed this hunger, turning killers into heroes and outlaws into folk saints. For Texans especially, the fusion was natural. Their culture of honor already glorified the man who stood tall and fought for his name. Whether he fought for cattle, cards, or loot from a stagecoach was irrelevant. What mattered was courage, skill, and the willingness to shoot. Jesse James's shadow stretched long. In the years after his death, young cowboys across the West bragged of riding with him, whether true or not. Gangs in Texas, New Mexico, and Kansas adopted his methods. Daylight robberies, theatrical style, and the use of six-shooters as both weapon and symbol. Even the James, younger name carried weight. Frank James, who survived his brother, surrendered and later toured the country as a lecturer, retelling their exploits with a showman's flair. Audiences packed theaters to hear him, proving that by then, the gunfighter was as much entertainment as history. By the 1880s, the myth of the outlaw gunfighter was fully formed. The press had created a pantheon: Hickok, Hardin, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Sam Bass. Each was different, yet together they represented a single idea: the man who lived by the gun, who carved his own law into the frontier. Reality was harsher. Most died young, betrayed, or shot down. Few left behind wealth or family. But in the imagination of America, they were immortal. And at the heart of this pantheon, tying it all together, was Texas. Texans rode with Jesse James, sheltered his allies, and spawned their own outlaws in his image. The Lone Star had already made the West wild. Now it gave the outlaw myth its sharpest edge. The gunfighter had begun as a duelist, born in the smoke of Springfield when Hickok faced Tut. But by the time Jesse James fell, the archetype had evolved. He was now also the outlaw, the train robber, the man who fought not just for honor but for fortune. And in this new age, the stories only grew larger. By the late 1870s, the cattle towns of Kansas were fading. The railroads pushed deeper into Texas, closing the old Chisholm Trail. Abilene, Wichita, Dodge, each had burned bright and violent, then cooled into quiet respectability. But for Wyatt Earp, the story was just beginning. Earp had made his name in Wichita and Dodge City as a lawman who combined cold calculation with unflinching toughness. He was not a fast-draw artist like Hickok, nor a killer by impulse like Hardin. Instead, he was deliberate, willing to strike first if needed, but always with the appearance of law behind him. That balance between order and violence defined him, and it would carry him to his most famous hour. In 1879, Wyatt, along with his brothers Virgil and Morgan, drifted west to the booming silver town of Tombstone, Arizona. It was a place of sudden wealth, where mines pulled millions from the ground and gamblers, outlaws, and fortune seekers from across the country converged. Tombstone was raw, brash, and dangerous. Its streets echoed with the same sound heard years before in Kansas. The clink of spurs, the shuffle of cards, the bark of six-shooters. The Earps found themselves in conflict with a group known simply as the Cowboys. The Cowboys were not ranchers in the innocent sense. They were loosely organized bands of outlaws, many of them Texans who had drifted west. They stole cattle from Mexican ranchers, smuggled goods across the border, and drank and gambled in Tombstone's saloons with pistols strapped low. Their leaders, men like Ike Clanton, Curly Bill Brocious, and Johnny Ringo, carried reputations as hard as the land they rode. To the Earps, the Cowboys were criminals. To the Cowboys, the Earps were outsiders, lawmen and gamblers who meddled in business that wasn't theirs. The conflict between them was inevitable. The tension built slowly. Fistfights in saloons, threats exchanged in the streets, accusations of horse theft and robbery. But beneath it all lay a deeper truth. This was a clash of cultures. The Cowboys embodied the Texan code of honor, brash, defiant, unwilling to bow to the badge of any lawman. The Earps represented the new order, law not by personal code but by civic authority, backed by courts and mayors. Each side believed the other had to yield, and neither was willing to bend. By October 1881, the standoff reached its breaking point. On the morning of October 26th, Ike Clanton and his allies filled Tombstone with talk of killing the Earps. They loitered near the OK Corral, armed and ready. The citizens of the town, weary of threats, turned to Virgil Earp, the city marshal, to act. Virgil deputized his brothers Wyatt and Morgan, as well as their friend, the consumptive but deadly gambler Doc Holliday. Together, the four men walked down Fremont Street toward the lot beside the OK Corral. Witnesses described them as calm, deliberate, their coats brushing against holstered revolvers, their faces set in grim resolve. At the lot stood the Cowboys: Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, Tom and Frank McClory, and others. Shouts rang out, orders to disarm, curses of defiance. And then, in a heartbeat, the silence shattered. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted barely half a minute. Pistols roared, smoke filled the air, and men fell. When it was over, Billy Clanton and the McClory brothers lay dead in the dust. Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded. Doc Holliday carried powder burns on his face. Wyatt alone was untouched, standing as if fate itself had decreed him invincible. The fight was not the largest or bloodiest of the frontier, but it was the most symbolic. It pitted lawmen against outlaws, order against chaos, civic authority against the Texan code of defiance. And in the balance stood the archetype of the gunfighter. The aftermath was as bloody as the fight itself. The Cowboys cried murder, claiming the Earps had gunned down unarmed men. Trials followed, witnesses gave conflicting accounts, and the town divided. In the end, the Earps were acquitted, the court ruling that the killings were justified in the line of duty. But justice did not end the feud. Months later, Morgan Earp was assassinated, shot in the back while playing billiards. Virgil was ambushed and crippled. Wyatt, consumed with rage, gathered a posse and rode out in what would be called the Earp Vendetta ride, hunting down those he believed responsible and leaving more corpses across Arizona's deserts. The line between lawman and outlaw blurred. Wyatt became what he had always fought, a man who killed without trial, guided by vengeance rather than badge. Yet it was this blurring, lawman as killer, outlaw as folk hero, that made Tombstone immortal. Newspapers back east devoured the story. Dime novels turned the OK Corral into a mythic showdown of good versus evil, even though the truth was murkier. Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and the Cowboys all became larger than life, their reputations cemented in the public imagination. And at the core of it, the Texans were still there. The Clantons and McClorys had come from Texas, carrying the same traditions of defiance that had made John Wesley Hardin and the Sutton-Taylor feud infamous. Tombstone may have been Arizona's story, but its roots were Texan. The Gunfighter, by 1881, had reached his full mythic form. He was no longer just a gambler in Kansas or an outlaw in Missouri. He was a figure of national fascination, a man who stood at the crossroads of law and violence. And in the lot beside the OK Corral, with the smoke still hanging over 3 dead cowboys, that myth burned itself into eternity. The dust of Tombstone never truly settled. The gunfight at the OK Corral in October 1881 had seared itself into the memory of the West, but its echoes stretched far beyond the streets of Arizona. For Wyatt Earp and his brothers, the victory was hollow. Morgan Earp lay in his grave, Virgil was crippled, and Wyatt himself was branded by some as a murderer who had used the badge as cover for vengeance. For the cowboys, the deaths of the Clantons and McClorys became rallying cries. Tombstone remained divided long after the smoke cleared. And for the country at large, the fight confirmed what many already believed. The Gunfighter was both hero and villain, lawman and killer, a man who walked a line so thin it was impossible to know on which side of justice he stood. But by the early 1880s, the world around them was changing. The cattle trails that had once carried Texas longhorns into Kansas were dying. Railroads now cut deep into Texas itself, eliminating the need for long drives. The great trail towns, Abilene, Wichita, Dodge, were fading into quiet respectability. Dodge still carried a hint of its wicked past, but its days as the queen of the cowtowns were over. The frontier itself was shrinking. Telegraph lines connected once isolated towns. Judges and sheriffs followed railroads west, bringing courts where once there had only been saloons. The age of the wide-open frontier, where men settled arguments with pistols in the street, was closing. For the gunfighters, the shift was stark. Some adapted. Bat Masterson, once the sheriff of Dodge City, reinvented himself as a journalist in New York City. He wrote colorful columns about sports and frontier legends, turning the myth he had lived into a career of words. The boy who had faced Texans in Dodge became a man of ink and paper, respected in the East as a chronicler of the very world he had once patrolled. Others withered. Doc Holliday, consumptive and worn from years of gambling and killing, drifted across the West until tuberculosis claimed him in a Colorado boarding house in 1887. Legend says his last words were bitter irony. "This is funny." He had expected to die with a gun in his hand, but death came in bed, quiet and unglamorous. And then there was John Wesley Hardin. Hardin's career as a killer had ended in 1877, when Texas Rangers finally captured him on a train. He spent 17 years in prison, reading law books and reflecting on his bloody past. Pardoned in 1894, he emerged older, heavier, and determined to reinvent himself as a lawyer. But the world had not forgotten the boy killer. Hardin opened an office in El Paso, but his temper had not cooled. He quarreled, gambled, and boasted of his past. In 1895, during yet another argument, this time with a local constable, Hardin was shot in the back of the head in a saloon. He died instantly, his glass of whiskey still in his hand. The deadliest gunfighter in Texas history had not fallen in a duel, but in a cheap saloon quarrel, killed as suddenly as he had once killed others. His death marked the symbolic end of the era he embodied. The gunfighter's decline was not just about individuals. It was about a society moving past the conditions that had created them. In the 1850s and 60s, Texas and the frontier had been places without law, where men carried their own justice at their belts. By the 1880s, that vacuum was filling. Rangers, sheriffs, courts, and telegraphs left less room for the code of the Colt. Disputes that once would have ended in blood now ended in lawsuits. Yet the myth did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger. The 1880s saw the rise of the dime novel industry, which devoured tales of gunfighters and outlaws. Hickok, Earp, Hardin, Billy the Kid, Jesse James. All became larger-than-life figures, their exploits exaggerated and dramatized until the truth was almost unrecognizable. To Eastern readers, The gunfighter was not a dangerous man who killed neighbors over poker debts. He was a knight of the frontier, a lone figure who stood tall against chaos. The reality of blood in the dust and bodies in the street was transformed into romance. The irony was sharp. Just as the gunfighter was vanishing from reality, he was being born anew in myth. By the end of the 1880s, the old names were either dead or fading into obscurity. Hickok had been shot in the back years before, Hardin was gone, Billy the Kid buried, Jesse James murdered by his own man. Wyatt Earp alone lived on, moving from boomtown to boomtown, seeking fortune and carrying his legend with him. The world of the frontier was closing, but the legend of the gunfighter was just beginning to open. The gunfight at the OK Corral had given Wyatt Earp a place in history, but it was his vengeance afterward that turned him into legend. When Morgan Earp was assassinated in March 1882, Wyatt snapped. No longer content to trust courts or trials, he gathered a posse of loyalists, including Doc Holliday, and rode into the desert to mete out his own justice. They ambushed suspects in canyons, shot them in riverside camps, and left their bodies as warnings. Witnesses later claimed Wyatt himself gunned down Frank Stillwell, one of the cowboy leaders, in a Tucson rail yard, filling him with bullets at close range. The Earp Vendetta ride, as it became known, blurred the line between law enforcement and outlawry. The law had made Wyatt a marshal. Vengeance had made him something else entirely. When the smoke cleared, Wyatt Earp was no longer welcome in Tombstone. He drifted westward, carrying his reputation like a burden he could not set down. The rest of his life was a strange coda to the violence of his youth. Wyatt chased fortunes in the silver mines of Colorado, the gold camps of Alaska, and the gambling houses of California. He worked as a saloon keeper, a boxing referee, even a consultant for early Hollywood westerns. In his later years, he lived quietly with his common-law wife, Josie, in Los Angeles. But the past never left him. Writers sought him out, and Wyatt was careful to shape the story. He downplayed the vendetta, emphasized his role as a lawman, and polished his legend until he gleamed. When he died in 1929 at the age of 80, newspapers hailed him not as a killer but as the last great gunfighter of the Old West. It was not entirely true, but by then truth mattered less than memory. Other gunfighters met less grand ends. Doc Holliday, coughing blood into handkerchiefs, died in 1887 in a Glenwood Springs sanitarium, far from the saloons where he had lived and fought. His last words, "This is funny," captured the irony of a gambler who had expected a gun but received a bed.
Masterson thrived.
He abandoned Dodge City, moved east, and remade himself as a journalist and sports writer in New York. He lived until 1921, a respected man of letters, far removed from the Buffalo Plains where he had once fought Texans. John Wesley Hardin, released from prison in the 1890s, could not outrun his past. His attempt at respectability as a lawyer in El Paso collapsed in drinking, gambling, and old quarrels. In 1895, he was shot in the back of the head in a saloon, his end as sudden and violent as his beginning. By the 1890s, the era of the gunfighter was over. Railroads crossed Texas and the plains. Telegraphs sent news faster than any posse could ride. Judges, sheriffs, and organized rangers brought a semblance of order to places that had once lived by pistols alone. The cattle frontier shrank as barbed wire fenced in the open range. Families that had once feuded across counties now settled their disputes in courts. The Wild West had not vanished. Violence still simmered in pockets. But the unique culture that had birthed the gunfighter was fading. And yet, just as the real men were dying, their legends were taking flight. Dime novels and stage plays transformed the blood of the frontier into entertainment. Hickok became a gallant knight of the plains. Jesse James, a noble robber. Billy the Kid, a tragic youth cut down too soon. Wyatt Earp, the fearless marshal who faced the cowboys at high noon. The reality: gambling debts, drunken quarrels, ambushes in the dark, was lost beneath layers of myth. The public didn't want messy truth. They wanted heroes and villains, men who stood tall in the dust with the sun at their backs. The gunfighter, as a living figure, had been buried in the 1880s. But as a legend, he was immortal. Texas had been his birthplace. Missouri, Kansas, New Mexico, and Arizona had carried him forward. And now the nation itself embraced him, not as a man, but as a symbol of America's restless, violent, uncompromising frontier spirit. The pistols had gone silent, but the echoes of those shots in Springfield, in Dodge, in Lincoln, in Tombstone would never fade. The open range was freedom. For decades, cattle had roamed unfenced across Texas and the plains, herded by boys on horseback who drove them north to Kansas railheads. The world of the cowboy, and of the gunfighter who often followed him, depended on that openness. The land was shared, the grass was free, and disputes were settled by courage and pistols rather than contracts. But by the late 1870s, a simple invention was changing everything: barbed wire. Barbed wire was cheap, easy to string, and brutally effective. A single strand could stretch for miles, turning open range into private property overnight. Ranchers who once shared the land now fenced it, protecting waterholes and grazing ground. For small farmers, it was salvation, a way to keep herds out of crops. For cattle barons and trail drivers, it was a nightmare. The fence-cutting wars erupted in Texas during the early 1880s. Cowboys and small ranchers who saw their way of life threatened rode by night with wire cutters, tearing down miles of fencing. In retaliation, large landowners armed their hands to guard the wire. Gunfire followed. Men died in disputes over who had the right to the land, and once again the revolver became the final argument. But this time the state pushed back. In 1884, Texas made fence-cutting a felony. Rangers and sheriffs enforced the law, and slowly the cutters faded. The open range was gone. The barbed wire stayed. The end of the open range struck at the very heart of the cowboy's world. The great trail drives dwindled, then ended, as railroads pushed deeper into Texas. Why drive herds 1,000 miles when trains could carry them in days? The legendary trails, the Chisholm, the Western, the Goodnight, Loving, grew quiet. With them went the wild saloons of Kansas. Abilene had already settled, Wichita too. Dodge City hung on for a while, but even Dodge surrendered to law and respectability. The era when young Texans rode into town with pistols swinging and saloons roared until dawn was over. For the gunfighter, the transformation was devastating. His world had been built on disorder. Open land, weak law, feuds and cattle thefts. Saloons where cards and whiskey fueled quarrels. Barbed wire and railroads brought order, contracts, courts, and judges. There was less room for a man who lived by the six-shooter. Some tried to adapt. Wyatt Earp sought fortune in mining camps and gambling halls, chasing the next boom. Bat Masterson found his reinvention in journalism. Others, like Hardin, could not change and met their ends in saloons, shot down as relics of another time. The culture that had bred them was vanishing, fenced in by wire and tamed by law. And yet, as the gunfighter disappeared from the landscape, he was being reborn in print. The dime novel industry exploded in the 1880s and 1890s. Cheap, sensational, and widely read, these paperbacks devoured the stories of Hickok, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and the Earps. They exaggerated, distorted, and outright invented tales, but they gave readers back east what they craved: heroes and villains of a dying frontier. Wild Bill became a knight-errant of the plains. Jesse James became Robin Hood. Billy the Kid became a tragic young rebel. Wyatt Earp became the fearless marshal of Tombstone. The reality of drunken quarrels, ambushes, and senseless killings was replaced by myth, clean, cinematic, timeless. The gunfighter was vanishing in fact, but in fiction he was immortal. By the 1890s, the great frontier that had bred the gunfighter was vanishing. The trails were gone, the herds fenced in, and the old feuds broken by the Texas Rangers and the courts. Where once pistols had been judge and jury, now contracts and barbed wire decided the fate of land and cattle. Towns that had been wild outposts turned into quiet county seats. Dodge City, once the wickedest little city in America, boasted churches, schools, and brick buildings. The world no longer needed the gunfighter, but a handful of men tried to hold on. In New Mexico, remnants of Billy the Kid's regulators drifted into the 1880s, fighting petty rustling wars that never reached the scale of the Lincoln County War. In Texas, young men inspired by Hardin and Sam Bass made brief, bloody attempts at outlawry before being hunted down by Rangers. In Arizona, the cowboys who had fought the Earps scattered or were killed. By the end of the century, the gunfighter had become a rarity, a relic. Yet, at the very moment the reality faded, the theater of the gunfighter came alive. Buffalo Bill Cody, once a real scout and Indian fighter, created his Wild West show, a traveling extravaganza that brought the frontier to audiences across America and Europe. On stage, riders performed mock battles, sharpshooters dazzled crowds, and actors reenacted famous gunfights. For audiences in Chicago, London, or Paris, the Wild West was not Texas feuds or bloody saloons. It was spectacle. And the gunfighter, now cleaned of his harsher truths, became a star attraction. Cody's show featured Annie Oakley, the sharpshooting prodigy, whose accuracy with a rifle captivated crowds. It reenacted stagecoach robberies, train holdups, and saloon shootouts. The legends of Hickok, Jesse James, and Billy the Kid were retold not as history but as performance. The messy, violent men of the frontier were being transformed into cultural heroes. This transformation was no accident. America in the 1890s was changing rapidly, industrializing, urbanizing, filling with immigrants. The Wild West, just recently tamed, became a nostalgic dream of a simpler time, when a single man with a six-shooter could decide his own fate. The gunfighter became the embodiment of freedom, self-reliance, and courage. Even if in life, most had been drunks, gamblers, and killers, the myth replaced the man. Meanwhile, the last gunfighters died off one by one. John Wesley Hardin was killed in 1895, shot in the back of the head during a saloon quarrel in El Paso. Clay Allison, once feared as a madman of the plains, fell from a wagon in 1887 and was crushed under its wheels. Luke Short, gambler and gunman, died quietly of illness in 1893. Each death was another closing door. The generation that had once carried pistols into Kansas cowtowns and Texas feuds was gone. But they were not forgotten. Dime novels kept their stories alive. Newspapers, always hungry for drama, republished tales of gunfights long after the men were dead. And as the 20th century dawned, a new medium, film, began to take their place. Silent westerns appeared as early as the 1900s, carrying the image of the lone gunfighter onto the screen. Wyatt Earp himself, old and gray in Los Angeles, advised filmmakers on how gunfights really happened. He left out the drunken brawls, the ambushes, the accidents. He described clean duels, two men face to face, revolvers at the ready. Hollywood listened, and so the gunfighter, as he had truly lived, disappeared. In his place stood the myth, tall, noble, and immortal. The closing of the frontier was not just a historical fact. It was a transformation of memory. The men who had once haunted Texas saloons and Kansas cattle towns were gone, but their shadows had grown larger than ever. The barbed wire had fenced them out. The railroads had made them obsolete. The law had buried them, but in America's imagination, they were eternal. The frontier was dying, but the outlaw was not yet finished. In the 1890s, railroads stitched the West together, barbed wire carved it into parcels, and towns grew into cities. The law stretched farther than it ever had before. Posses could now ride trains, telegraphs could send word across states in minutes, and the wide-open land that had sheltered Jesse James and John Wesley Hardin was shrinking. And yet, in the canyonlands of Wyoming and Utah, a new gang of outlaws was rising, one that would become the last great name in the saga of the gunfighter. They called themselves the Wild Bunch. At the center of it all was Butch Cassidy. Born Robert Leroy Parker in 1866 in Utah Territory, Cassidy was not cut from the same cloth as Hardin or Billy the Kid. He was not driven by temper or pride, but by charm and calculation. He was quick with a smile, easy to befriend, and, above all, loyal to his gang. If Hardin had been the killer and Jesse James the avenger, Butch Cassidy was the outlaw as folk hero, laughing, daring, and endlessly resourceful. By his side rode Harry Longabout, better known as the Sundance Kid. Quieter than Butch, deadlier with a pistol, Sundance provided the steel to Cassidy's grin. Together, they formed the heart of the Wild Bunch, a loose confederation of outlaws who robbed banks, trains, and payrolls across the Mountain West. Their style was bold, theatrical, and surprisingly modern. Unlike the lone gunfighters of earlier decades, the Wild Bunch planned their robberies with military precision. They struck trains at high speed, blasting safes with dynamite and scattering posses with covering fire. They robbed banks in broad daylight, then vanished into the wilderness, leaving sheriffs and marshals bewildered. Their hideout, the legendary Hole in the Wall in Wyoming, became a fortress of outlawry. Tucked in a canyon, accessible only by narrow trails, it offered safety from lawmen. Here the gang rested, counted their loot, and planned the next raid. For a time, it seemed no law could touch them. The Wild Bunch carried echoes of Texas in their ranks. Many members were cowboys from Texas or Oklahoma, men raised in the same culture of six-shooters and cattle drives that had bred Hardin and the Sutton-Taylor feud. They brought with them the Texan code: loyalty to the gang, defiance of authority, and a readiness to kill when cornered. Butch Cassidy himself admired the Texas Rangers even as he defied them. He studied their tactics, knew their relentlessness, and planned his escapes accordingly. The Rangers had been the nemesis of Texas gunfighters. For the Wild Bunch, they were the model of the kind of force they had to outwit. Their fame peaked in the late 1890s with a series of spectacular robberies. In 1899, they hit the Union Pacific Overland Flyer in Wyoming, blowing the express car safe with dynamite and escaping with tens of thousands of dollars. The blast was so powerful it destroyed much of the car itself, scattering bills across the prairie. Posses gave chase, but the gang vanished into the hole in the wall. The following year, they struck again, hitting banks in Montana and payroll trains in Nevada. Newspapers tracked their every move, calling them the last of the great outlaws. For the public weary of industrial cities and modern machines, the Wild Bunch was a reminder of a wilder time. But the law was no longer what it had been in Jesse James's day. By 1900, the Wild Bunch were the most wanted men in the West. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, already famous for hunting Jesse James, now had their sights set on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Railroads and banks poured money into the pursuit, determined to end the raids that embarrassed their growing empires. Posters bearing the outlaws' faces appeared in towns from Wyoming to New Mexico. And yet, Butch and Sundance thrived. Their robberies became more daring, their escapes more legendary. When posses closed in, they vanished into canyons or scattered across the plains. Their loyalty to one another kept them alive. Butch's charm calming tempers, Sundance's revolver silencing danger. But even the best-planned outlawry had limits. Technology was changing faster than they could adapt. Telegraphs flashed warnings within minutes of a robbery. Trains carried armed guards. Automobiles, still rare but growing, promised faster pursuits than horses could endure. The frontier had closed, and the Wild Bunch knew it. In 1901, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid made their most fateful decision. They fled. Taking Sundance's companion, the schoolteacher Etta Place, they boarded a ship and sailed for South America. Their destination was Argentina, a land of vast ranches and open country that looked, to their eyes, like the Texas and Wyoming of 30 years before. For a time, it worked. Butch and Sundance bought land, raised cattle, and tried to live as respectable ranchers. Neighbors liked them. Etta charmed the community, but outlawry was in their blood. When money ran low, the old habits returned. Banks in Argentina and payroll wagons in Chile began to fall prey to masked riders who bore a striking resemblance to the American fugitives. Back in the United States, newspapers tracked their adventures with fascination. The Pinkertons issued reports confirming what many suspected: the Wild Bunch had gone international. The chase, once limited to the canyons of Wyoming, now stretched across continents. The myth grew even as the men themselves struggled. Butch dreamed of settling, perhaps even securing amnesty. Sundance, less trusting, kept his revolvers close. And always, there was the shadow of the law creeping closer. The end came in Bolivia in 1908. Accounts differ, but the most accepted story tells of a payroll robbery near the mining town of San Vicente. Butch and Sundance, pursued by Bolivian soldiers, found themselves cornered in a small adobe house. Surrounded and outnumbered, they exchanged gunfire late into the night. When silence finally fell, the soldiers entered to find both men dead. One had a bullet wound to the head, the other to the chest. Some claimed Butch shot Sundance to spare him capture, then turned the pistol on himself. Others believed they fought to the last round. The truth was swallowed by the dust of San Vicente. No one could say for certain who fired the final shots. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were gone? Or were they? Almost immediately, rumors sprang up. Some said the bodies in Bolivia were misidentified, that Butch returned secretly to the U.S. under another name. Others swore Sundance lived for decades in South America. Imposters came forward, telling stories of their supposed escapes. As with Jesse James and Billy the Kid, death only fueled the legend. What mattered was not how they died, but what they represented. The Wild Bunch was the last outlaw band of the frontier. They carried pistols and Winchesters, rode horses into battle, and vanished into wilderness hideouts. They were the heirs of Jesse James, Sam Bass, and John Wesley Hardin, men forged in the Texas code of loyalty, pride, and defiance. But they were also the end of the line. After them, the outlaw belonged not to the West but to history, theater, and film. Their legend only grew in the 20th century. Books romanticized them, songs told their story, and in 1969, Hollywood immortalized them in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, with Paul Newman and Robert Redford laughing their way into myth. By then, the frontier was long gone, but the myth of the gunfighter, the man who lived free, stood defiant, and died with pistols in his hands, still resonated. The Wild Bunch had been the last true outlaws. Their deaths in Bolivia closed the chapter that had begun in Texas with Hardin, Hickok, and Jesse James. But their legend ensured that the story of the gunfighter would never end. By 1900, the Wild Bunch were the most wanted men in the West. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, already famous for hunting Jesse James, now had their sights set on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Railroads and banks poured money into the pursuit, determined to end the raids that embarrassed their growing empires. Posters bearing the outlaws' faces appeared in towns from Wyoming to New Mexico, and yet Butch and Sundance thrived. Their robberies became more daring, their escapes more legendary. When posses closed in, they vanished into canyons or scattered across the plains. Their loyalty to one another kept them alive. Butch's charm calming tempers, Sundance's revolver silencing danger. But even the best-planned outlawry had limits. Technology was changing faster than they could adapt. Telegraphs flashed warnings within minutes of a robbery. Trains carried armed guards. Automobiles, still rare but growing, promised faster pursuits than horses could endure. The frontier had closed, and the Wild Bunch knew it. In 1901, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid made their most fateful decision. They fled. Taking Sundance's companion, the schoolteacher Etta Place, they boarded a ship and sailed for South America. Their destination was Argentina, a land of vast ranches and open country that looked, to their eyes, like the Texas and Wyoming of 30 years before. For a time, it worked. Butch and Sundance bought land, raised cattle, and tried to live as respectable ranchers. Neighbors liked them. Etta charmed the community, but outlawry was in their blood. When money ran low, the old habits returned. Banks in Argentina and payroll wagons in Chile began to fall prey to masked riders who bore a striking resemblance to the American fugitives. Back in the United States, newspapers tracked their adventures with fascination. The Pinkertons issued reports confirming what many suspected: the Wild Bunch had gone international. The chase, once limited to the canyons of Wyoming, now stretched across continents. The myth grew even as the men themselves struggled. Butch dreamed of settling, perhaps even securing amnesty. Sundance, less trusting, kept his revolvers close. And always, there was the shadow of the law creeping closer. The end came in Bolivia in 1908. Accounts differ, but the most accepted story tells of a payroll robbery near the mining town of San Vicente. Butch and Sundance, pursued by Bolivian soldiers, found themselves cornered in a small adobe house. Surrounded and outnumbered, they exchanged gunfire late into the night. When silence finally fell, the soldiers entered to find both men dead. One had a bullet wound to the head, the other to the chest. Some claimed Butch shot Sundance to spare him capture, then turned the pistol on himself. Others believed they fought to the last round. The truth was swallowed by the dust of San Vicente. No one could say for certain who fired the final shots. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were gone? Or were they? Almost immediately, rumors sprang up. Some said the bodies in Bolivia were misidentified, that Butch returned secretly to the U.S. under another name. Others swore Sundance lived for decades in South America. Imposters came forward, telling stories of their supposed escapes. As with Jesse James and Billy the Kid, death only fueled the legend. What mattered was not how they died, but what they represented. The Wild Bunch was the last outlaw band of the frontier. They carried pistols and Winchesters, rode horses into battle, and vanished into wilderness hideouts. They were the heirs of Jesse James, Sam Bass, and John Wesley Hardin, men forged in the Texas code of loyalty, pride, and defiance. But they were also the end of the line. After them, the outlaw belonged not to the West but to history, theater, and film. Their legend only grew in the 20th century. Books romanticized them. Songs told their story. And in 1969, Hollywood immortalized them in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, with Paul Newman and Robert Redford laughing their way into myth. By then, the frontier was long gone. But the myth of the gunfighter, the man who lived free, stood defiant, and died with pistols in his hands, still resonated. The Wild Bunch had been the last true outlaws. Their deaths in Bolivia closed the chapter that had begun in Texas with Hardin, Hickok, and Jesse James. But their legend ensured that the story of the gunfighter would never end. Long before Jesse James robbed his first bank, long before Wyatt Earp walked into Tombstone, the sound of gunfire echoed across Texas. It was not the pistol duel of gambler against gambler, nor the drunken quarrel of cowboys in a saloon. It was war, a decades-long struggle between settlers and native nations, fought with rifles, pistols, lances, and bows, across a landscape vast and unforgiving. To understand the gunfighter, one must first understand the war zone that was Texas. The most feared warriors of the frontier were the Comanche. Masters of the horse, they dominated the southern plains for generations, riding swift and silent, striking with deadly precision. Their raids reached deep into Texas, burning settlements, stealing horses, and carrying captives back to their camps. To settlers, they were a nightmare. To their own people, they were defenders of a homeland under siege. Against them rode the settlers, often armed with little more than single-shot rifles and pistols. Every farmstead was a fortress, every family living with the knowledge that tomorrow might bring fire and blood. Children were raised in the shadow of violence, learning early that survival depended on readiness to fight. This crucible forged a culture where weapons were not just tools but extensions of life itself. It was in this world that the Texas gunfighter was born. By the 1850s, the struggle had become relentless. Settlers poured in, the U.S. Army built forts, and the Comanche fought back with ferocity. Raids swept down rivers, cutting through counties like storms. Families were massacred, cattle stolen, soldiers ambushed. The Texas Rangers, still in their formative years, became the spearhead of defense. Mounted, lightly armed, and ruthless, they fought the Comanche with the same mobility and aggression. The revolver, the Colt 6-shooter, became their weapon of choice, and it changed everything. Where a single-shot rifle faltered in close combat, the revolver allowed Rangers to fire again and again from horseback. In battles across the plains, the 6-shooter proved decisive. The Comanche, once unmatched in mounted warfare, now faced an enemy with firepower as relentless as their own speed. These wars were brutal. At Adobe Walls, at Pease River, at Palo Duro Canyon, blood flowed freely. Entire Comanche villages were destroyed, their horses slaughtered, their people forced onto reservations. But the violence did not belong to one side alone. Settlers and Rangers killed without mercy, and native raids continued deep into Texas. It was a cycle of reprisal, each act demanding another. The land itself seemed to drink violence, shaping all who lived on it. The Apache Wars added another layer. In the deserts of West Texas and New Mexico, Apache bands resisted with guerrilla tactics, striking swiftly and vanishing into mountains and canyons. They fought not only settlers but also U.S. soldiers, defying efforts to confine them. Their raids were legendary for endurance, covering vast distances in days. For Texans, the Apaches were another relentless enemy. For the Apaches, they were fighting for survival against a tide that could not be stopped. The legacy of these wars was profound. They taught Texans that life was precarious, that survival required vigilance and readiness to kill. They created a society where children grew up with rifles by the door, where pistols were worn not just for show but for defense. They forged the idea that honor meant standing one's ground, even in the face of certain death. And they shaped the Rangers into the hardened force that would later hunt outlaws and feuding clans. The same men who once fought Comanche raiders would turn their pistols on John Wesley Hardin or the Corral brothers. The skills were the same, only the targets had changed. By the 1870s, the wars between settlers and native peoples in Texas were reaching their final, tragic stage. The Comanche, once the lords of the southern plains, had been battered by decades of relentless conflict. The Colt revolver, repeating rifles, and the unending tide of settlers had tipped the balance. But it was not just technology, it was strategy. The Texas Rangers, now seasoned by years of raids, learned to fight Comanche tactics with their own. Swift strikes, relentless pursuit, no quarter given. The decisive blow came at Palo Duro Canyon in 1874. There, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie led U.S. cavalry, supported by Rangers, into the Comanche heartland. They attacked villages at dawn, burning teepees, destroying stores of food, and, most devastating of all, slaughtering more than 1,000 Comanche horses. Without their mounts, the Comanche could no longer wage the war that had defined them for generations. Defeated, starving, and broken, they were forced onto reservations. The age of the Comanche was over. The Apache Wars stretched longer, lingering into the 1880s. Bands under leaders like Victorio and Geronimo fought with unmatched skill, raiding across West Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. They used the land itself as a weapon, vanishing into deserts where soldiers died of thirst, striking suddenly in mountain passes, crossing into Mexico to escape pursuit. But even the Apaches could not withstand the pressure forever. In 1886, Geronimo finally surrendered after years of pursuit by soldiers, scouts, and rangers. With him ended the last major chapter of native resistance in Texas and the Southwest. For settlers, the wars brought a sense of triumph, but also a lasting mark. Generations had grown up in a world where danger came not just from rival outlaws or drunken quarrels, but from raids that might strike in the dead of night. Children were taught to shoot almost as soon as they could walk. Families lived with rifles by their beds. The line between civilian and soldier blurred. This constant readiness for violence became part of Texas identity. And it is no coincidence that the state produced so many gunfighters. John Wesley Hardin, Ben Thompson, Clay Allison, they were born into homes where guns were not optional. They grew up in a culture where courage was measured by one's willingness to fight, and where hesitation could mean death. The wars against the Comanche and Apache hardened Texas into a land where the revolver was not just a weapon but a symbol of survival. The influence reached even farther. The Texas Rangers, sharpened in the crucible of native wars, carried those same ruthless methods into the pursuit of outlaws and feuding families. The ambushes, midnight rides, and relentless chases they had once used against Comanche bands were now turned against men like Hardin, the Suttons, or the Corrals. The Gunfighter and the Ranger were two sides of the same coin, both born from a land where violence was not just common, but expected. By the time the last native wars ended in the 1880s, the Gunfighter era was already in full stride. Hickok had fallen in Deadwood, Jesse James was dead in Missouri, Billy the Kid in New Mexico, the Earps in Arizona. But all of them carried, in their stories, echoes of Texas and its long frontier war. The myth of the gunfighter, proud, fearless, armed with 6 shooters and honor, was shaped as much by the war with native peoples as by any saloon duel or cattle feud. For decades, Texas had been a battlefield. And out of that battlefield came men who believed violence was not just a tool but a way of life. The Comanche and Apache had fought for their homes. The settlers had fought for their future. Out of that collision came a society steeped in blood, one that gave America its most enduring legend, the gunfighter. And though the native wars ended, their shadow never did. Every time a Texan gambler drew his pistol in a saloon, every time a ranger fired into a rustler's camp, the echo of Palo Duro and adobe walls lingered in the smoke. By the 1880s, Texas was changing. The open range was shrinking, the cattle trails were dying, and barbed wire carved the land into parcels. But the culture of the six-shooter had not disappeared. It lived on in men like Ben Thompson and King Fisher, figures who embodied the contradictions of the gunfighter. Killers who could be charming, outlaws who sometimes wore badges, men who lived by violence yet commanded respect. Ben Thompson was born in England in 1843 but raised in Texas. From the beginning, he seemed destined for violence. As a teenager, he killed in quarrels, fought in the Civil War, and afterward became a gambler, a profession almost synonymous with the gunfighter's trade. Thompson was not flamboyant like Wild Bill Hickok, nor reckless like John Wesley Hardin. He was calm, deliberate, and deadly. At the poker table, he was charming, often smiling. But beneath the grin was the cold assurance of a man who had killed and would kill again. His reputation spread from Austin to Dodge City, where he crossed paths with Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson. Everywhere he went, men spoke of his icy composure and his unerring aim. But what set Thompson apart was that he did not remain a simple gambler. In 1881, he was elected City Marshal of Austin. The killer now wore a badge. As Marshal, Thompson proved effective. He cleaned up Austin streets, imposed order on saloons, and faced down troublemakers with the same calm menace he had always carried. Citizens admired his efficiency. Gamblers respected him because he was one of their own. For a time, it seemed Ben Thompson had reconciled the contradiction of the West, outlaw instincts with lawman authority. But beneath the badge, he remained the same man. In 1882, Thompson killed Jack Harris, a theater owner in San Antonio, during a quarrel. Though acquitted, the killing left enemies who waited for revenge. 2 years later, Thompson returned to San Antonio to visit the Vaudeville Theater, owned by Harris's partners. It was a fatal mistake. In March 1884, as Thompson sat in the theater with his friend King Fisher, gunmen ambushed them. Both men were cut down in a hail of bullets. Thompson died instantly. Fisher lingered briefly before succumbing. The ambush ended Ben Thompson's career, but it also cemented his legend. He had been both marshal and gambler, killer and lawman, loved and feared. He was, in many ways, the purest example of the Texan gunfighter, a man who lived and died by the gun, no matter what badge he wore. If Thompson was the cold gambler, King Fisher was the outlaw who flirted with respectability. Born in 1854 in Texas, Fisher grew up among violence. By his 20s, he had joined outlaw bands that raided Mexican ranches, stealing cattle and horses across the border. He was flamboyant in dress, embroidered vests, silver-trimmed pistols, bright sashes, and just as flamboyant in violence. He killed rivals, shot down sheriffs, and carved out a reputation as one of the deadliest men on the border. Yet Fisher was not a simple bandit. Like many Texans of his generation, he lived by a code of loyalty and courage. He protected friends, was courteous to women, and despised cowardice. This duality made him both feared and admired. Incredibly, by the late 1870s, Fisher transitioned into law enforcement. He served as sheriff of Uvalde County, where he enforced order with the same pistols he once used for outlawry. Much like Thompson, he blurred the line between outlaw and lawman, embodying the contradictions of a society where reputation mattered more than legality. His end came beside Thompson in San Antonio, gunned down in the same ambush. Two of the deadliest men in Texas history, killed not in fair fight but in a trap, a reminder that even gunfighters could not always control the terms of their death. If Ben Thompson and Kingfisher embodied the gambler lawman and the outlaw-turned-sheriff, others of their generation showed just how flexible and dangerous the role of the gunfighter could be. Luke Short was one of them. Born in Arkansas but raised in Texas, Short became a gambler early in life, drifting from town to town with a deck of cards and a Colt revolver. He stood small in stature, barely 5'6", but made up for it with charm and nerve. His soft voice and dapper dress belied a deadly reputation. Short cut his teeth in Dodge City, where he became friends with Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp. Together they formed what would later be called the Dodge City Peace Commission, a loose fraternity of gamblers and gunfighters who ruled the town's saloons. Short fought duels in Dodge and in Texas, his accuracy earning him a place among the most feared men of his era. Yet Short was also a businessman. He invested in gambling houses, managed saloons, and moved comfortably between outlaw circles and civic leaders. In Fort Worth and Dallas, he became a fixture of the gambling scene, his presence enough to keep rowdy cowboys in line. Short lived longer than most gunfighters, dying of illness in 1893. But in his lifetime, he epitomized the gambler gunman, the man who lived by cards and pistols, equally skilled in charm and violence. If Luke Short was ice, Clay Allison was fire. Born in Tennessee but raised in Texas, Allison was wild from youth. He fought in the Confederate Army, but it was after the war that his reputation exploded. Unstable, unpredictable, and often drunk, Allison killed for reasons that even contemporaries struggled to explain. He shot men over card games, arguments, and insults. In one infamous incident, he dug up the body of a man he had killed and carried it into a saloon, placing the corpse on a chair to remind others of his power. Such acts earned him the nickname the man they feared. Yet Allison, like so many Texas gunfighters, was not entirely a villain. Friends described him as generous, even gentle, when sober, but his temper, fueled by whiskey and pride, made him one of the most dangerous figures on the frontier. In the end, Allison did not fall in a gunfight. In 1887, he fell from a wagon while moving cattle and was crushed under its wheels. A violent life ended in a mundane accident, but his legend, the madman with a revolver, endured. These men, Thompson, Fisher, Short, Allison, formed the last great wave of Texas gunfighters. Each blurred the line between outlaw and lawman, gambler and sheriff. Each carried himself with a code of honor that could turn to murder in a heartbeat. And each became part of the myth that Texas exported to the wider world. That of the fearless man with a six-shooter, living by his wits and his courage. By the 1890s, they were gone. Thompson and Fisher ambushed. Allison crushed under a wagon. Short dead of illness. Their generation faded as the frontier hardened into order. But their stories did not fade. They joined the pantheon beside Hickok, Hardin, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Wyatt Earp. Together they formed a chorus of voices that defined the age of the gunfighter. The truth was messier than the legend. These men killed in saloons, not in noble duels. They were as often drunk as sober, as reckless as heroic. They served as lawmen when convenient, turned outlaw when it suited them, and lived always on the edge of violence. Yet myth does not demand truth. Myth demands drama. And in the stories told across Texas and the West, men like Thompson and Fisher became symbols of an era when courage was measured by the willingness to draw and fire. By the end of the 1880s, the gunfighter as a living figure was dying out. But as a legend, born in Texas, carried to Kansas, spread across the frontier, he was stronger than ever. The last great generation of Texas gunfighters had lived and died. The stage now belonged to their memory, retold in novels, Wild West shows, and soon enough, film. The frontier was closing, but the world was just starting to hear about it. By the 1890s, barbed wire had fenced in the cattle trails, the Rangers had tamed the feuds, and most of the famous gunfighters were dead. Yet instead of fading, their stories grew. The American public, increasingly urban, industrial, and far removed from the prairies, developed a hunger for tales of the wild country where a man's courage and his six-shooter could decide his fate. Into that hunger rode the Wild West shows. The greatest of them all was Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody had been a scout, buffalo hunter, and occasional soldier. He had known the frontier firsthand, but what made him immortal was his ability to sell it. In 1883, he launched Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a traveling extravaganza that turned the violence of the frontier into entertainment. The show featured sharpshooting exhibitions, mock battles, and dramatic reenactments of famous gunfights. Riders galloped across arenas, rifles cracking, while outlaws robbed stagecoaches and were gunned down by lawmen before cheering crowds. Indians were recruited, sometimes willingly, sometimes out of desperation, to play the role of the savage enemy, while white heroes triumphed in choreographed combat. It was spectacle, theater, and myth rolled into one. The gunfighter became a star of the Wild West. Audiences thrilled at seeing actors, and sometimes the real men themselves, reenact famous duels. Hickok, though dead, appeared in spirit. Jesse James's exploits were dramatized. Billy the Kid was reinvented as a tragic youth. Even Annie Oakley, the sharpshooter with uncanny aim, became part of the myth. Her performances, splitting cards in midair, shooting cigarettes from her husband's lips, convinced millions that the West was a land where skill with a gun defined greatness. The messy, bloody, often shameful reality of Texas saloon fights and outlaw raids was forgotten. What replaced it was clean, heroic, and thrilling. But the Wild West show was only the beginning. As the 20th century dawned, a new invention carried the myth even farther: motion pictures. The first Western films appeared before 1910. They were crude by modern standards, silent reels shot on backlots, but they carried familiar images. Cowboys with pistols, stagecoach robberies, duels in dusty streets. Audiences loved them. The West had already become a national story, and now it became a global one. And who advised some of these early filmmakers? None other than Wyatt Earp himself. In his old age, Earp lived in Los Angeles, where he befriended young filmmakers experimenting with Western stories. He told them how gunfights really happened. Men facing one another squarely, pistols drawn, courage tested in the open. He left out the drunken accidents, the ambushes, the shots in the back. He gave Hollywood the duel it craved. From his stories, the archetype of the cinematic gunfighter was born. Tall, stoic, facing his enemy under the high sun. It was not truth, but it was perfect myth. By the 1920s, the gunfighter no longer belonged to Texas or the frontier. He belonged to the world. Audiences in New York, London, and Paris thrilled to the tales of Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Wild Bill Hickok. Children played cowboys and outlaws in the streets of Chicago. The Wild West show had toured Europe, and Western films were spreading globally. The men themselves were gone, but their shadows strode larger than ever. By the turn of the century, the gunfighter was no longer flesh and blood. He was ink, theater, and celluloid. The dime novelists had begun the transformation decades earlier, turning Hardin into a tragic avenger, Jesse James into Robin Hood, Billy the Kid into a romantic rebel. They had taken the chaos of Texas feuds and Kansas saloons and given them narrative order. Duels instead of drunken quarrels, noble causes instead of gambling debts. The Wild West shows carried that transformation onto the stage, giving audiences spectacle. Galloping riders, blazing six-shooters, clean victories. Where once the Comanche or Apache wars had been brutal and tragic, now they became thrilling set pieces, complete with heroic rangers and doomed warriors. And then came film, the most powerful myth-making machine of them all. On screen, the gunfighter became myth incarnate. He was tall, stoic, morally certain. He stood in the street at high noon, facing his rival with steady hands. He fought not for whiskey or wounded pride, but for justice. In Hollywood's hands, the contradictions of men like Ben Thompson or John Wesley Hardin were erased. Outlaws became noble, lawmen became flawless, and the messy truth of the West gave way to cinematic clarity. The first silent westerns drew heavily from the real stories of Texas and Kansas, but always polished. The drunken Clay Allison became a composite villain. His cruelty softened into dramatic madness. Hickok's backshooting death in Deadwood was rewritten as the fall of a night. Jesse James's treachery at the hands of Robert Ford became a morality tale about betrayal. The truth had been bloody and often shameful. The myth was heroic. and the myth was what endured. Texas remained at the heart of it all. The dime novels loved Texas because it was the most violent canvas of the West. No other state produced so many feuds, outlaws, and rangers. The Wild West shows reenacted Texas Ranger victories, dramatized cattle raids, and staged saloon gunfights. Hollywood borrowed endlessly from Texas tales: Hardin, Thompson, Fisher, the Sutton Taylor feud, even when it set the story elsewhere. Texas gave the West its raw material. The rest of America turned that raw material into legend. The irony was sharp. The real gunfighters had lived hard, died young, and left few traces beyond bodies in the ground and newspaper clippings. But their afterlives, in novels, shows, and films, were eternal. Millions who had never seen Texas, never held a six-shooter, believed they knew the West. They believed in the lone gunman standing tall against chaos, the gambler with nerves of steel, the ranger who never flinched. And in a way, that belief reshaped America itself. The gunfighter was no longer just a man of the frontier. He was an idea. That courage and violence could make order, that one man with a gun could decide the fate of many. It was not history, but it was legend. By the 1920s, the Wild West shows were fading, replaced by the silver screen. But the work was done. The messy truth of Texas's blood-soaked history had been recast as the most enduring American myth, the Wild West gunfighter. The Colt was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol, and the gunfighter who carried it, once a flesh-and-blood Texan gambler or outlaw, now belonged to eternity. The Wild West was over in Texas. Barbed wire cut the plains, the Rangers patrolled the border, and cattle towns were quiet. But in Europe, thousands of miles away, the West was only beginning. When Buffalo Bill Cody launched his Wild West show in 1883, he had no idea how far it would travel. By the 1890s, his troupe was touring England, France, Germany, even Italy. They set up massive arenas on the outskirts of cities, building entire frontier towns out of wood and canvas. Inside, tens of thousands of Europeans sat wide-eyed as the American West came to life before them. They watched sharpshooters split playing cards. They cheered as stagecoaches were robbed by masked bandits. They gasped as native warriors thundered across the arena, only to be defeated by rangers and scouts in choreographed battles. For Europeans who had never seen Texas, Kansas, or the Plains, this was the West. And at the heart of it was the gunfighter. In London, Queen Victoria herself attended Buffalo Bill's performance in 1887. In Paris, the show drew crowds so large that traffic stopped for miles. In Rome, priests condemned it as barbaric, even as their congregations flocked to see it. The gunfighter, once a half-drunken gambler in a Dodge City saloon, had become an international celebrity. Dime novels crossed the ocean too. Cheaply printed in America, they were quickly translated into German, French, and Italian. Readers devoured tales of Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Wild Bill Hickok. To them, these men were not criminals but adventurers, modern knights of the frontier. In Germany, the writer Karl May, who had never set foot in the West, wrote sprawling sagas of cowboys and Indians. His characters were fictional, but they drew heavily from American dime novel archetypes. Generations of German readers grew up believing they understood the West, its deserts, its outlaws, its fearless gunfighters, through May's books. Texas, Kansas, New Mexico, all became landscapes of the imagination, exported around the world. Then came the movies. By the 1910s, Western films were being shown in theaters not just in America but in Europe, South America, and beyond. The sight of a lone gunfighter striding down a dusty street, hand hovering near his pistol, became one of the most recognizable images on Earth. It was simple, clear, and universal. A man, his courage, and his weapon. Hollywood smoothed away the messiness of reality. There were no drunken quarrels, no feuds that dragged on for decades, no outlaw gangs squabbling over loot. Instead, there was the gunfighter as hero, a man who stood against chaos and imposed order by force of will. Audiences everywhere understood him. He was not just Texan. He was universal. By the 1920s, the myth had circled the globe. Children in London played cowboys and Indians in alleyways. German readers idolized Karl May's Western characters. French intellectuals debated whether the gunfighter represented America's true spirit. In Mexico, where memories of raids and rangers were still raw, Hollywood westerns became popular entertainment, even though they sometimes depicted Mexicans as villains. The gunfighter was no longer just an American creation. He was a global archetype. By the early 20th century, the Texan gunfighter was no longer just a story. He was an ambassador of myth. In Europe, he became the face of America, rugged, independent, defiant. To nations crowded with monarchies, traditions, and rigid hierarchies, the gunfighter represented something electrifying. A man who answered to no one, who carried his own justice on his hip. For many, this was the essence of the New World. America was a place where class didn't matter, where a poor boy with a revolver could stand equal to a king. It was not the truth. The real gunfighters had been gamblers, drunks, and killers, but it was the image. An image was what traveled. In Germany, Karl May's Western novels sold in the millions. His characters, Old Shatterhand, Winnetou, were fictional, but they carried the DNA of Hickok, Jesse James, and Billy the Kid. German readers imagined the plains of Texas and New Mexico as vast playgrounds of freedom, even though May himself had never seen them. To this day, his books remain among the most read in the German language. In France, intellectuals saw the cowboy and gunfighter as symbols of liberty. Writers compared Jesse James to revolutionary heroes, arguing that America's outlaws embodied the same spirit of rebellion that had toppled monarchies in Europe. In Britain, Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Hollywood westerns reinforced the idea of America as a land of action and courage. The reserved British admired and feared the raw individualism of the gunfighter. Even in Japan, the archetype traveled. By the 1920s, American westerns were screened in Tokyo theaters. The image of the lone gunfighter bore striking similarities to the samurai of Japan's own past. Men who lived by honor, carried blades instead of pistols, and enforced their own codes. Japanese audiences recognized the parallel and embraced it. In Latin America, the reception was complex. Mexico, scarred by decades of cross-border raids and ranger brutality, had reason to resent the gunfighter image. Yet Hollywood films still found audiences, and in time, local filmmakers created their own versions, the Mexican charro with pistols, echoing the American cowboy. The myth was too strong to resist. Then came the World Wars, and the gunfighter's image deepened. During World War I, European soldiers carried dime novels and watched traveling films that showed American gunfighters taming the West. The message was clear. America was a land of men who stood their ground, and soon that same spirit would stand beside Europe in the trenches. By World War II, the cowboy gunfighter had become America's unofficial symbol abroad. Propaganda films compared U.S. soldiers to pioneers and gunslingers, standing against tyranny the way Wyatt Earp had stood against the cowboys of Tombstone. To allies, the image was reassuring. To enemies, it was intimidating. Either way, the Texan gunfighter had become more than myth. He was national identity. The irony was complete. The real men, Hardin, Thompson, Fisher, had died in saloons, shot in the back, drunk or betrayed. The culture that birthed them, Texas feuds, Comanche wars, cattle towns, was gone. But their ghosts lived everywhere. In German novels, French essays, Japanese theaters, British music halls, Latin American films, and American propaganda. The Texan gunfighter had escaped the frontier and conquered the imagination of the world. By the mid-20th century, the myth was unstoppable. The world no longer asked whether the stories were true. The world only asked for more. And Texas, bloody, violent, and proud, remained at the heart of it all. By the 1930s, America was deep in the Great Depression. Banks collapsed, bread lines stretched down city blocks, and the frontier, once a living memory, was now half a century past. But in movie theaters, the West still lived. Hollywood had discovered the Western early, in the silent days of the 1910s. But it was in the 1930s and 40s that the genre reached its golden age. Studios poured money into sprawling sets of frontier towns. Directors framed dusty duels and galloping posses against wide horizons. And actors, tall, stern, heroic, gave the gunfighter his definitive form. The Texan gunfighter, once outlaw and gambler, was reborn as the American knight. The face of this reinvention was John Wayne. In 1939, Wayne starred in Stagecoach, directed by John Ford. The film catapulted him from B-movie cowboy to Hollywood icon. Wayne's character, the Ringo Kid, was an outlaw, but an honorable one, brave, strong, and loyal. His pistols were not weapons of drunken quarrels, but tools of justice. Audiences loved it. In a time of hardship, Wayne's stoic confidence was a balm. He represented the America people wanted to believe in: courageous, straightforward, unyielding. From that point forward, John Wayne was the West. In dozens of films, he played variations of the same figure: marshal, cowboy, rancher, always a man of action, always carrying the authority of the gun. The messy reality of Hardin and Thompson was gone. The myth of the noble gunfighter was complete. Another defining moment came with Gary Cooper in High Noon, 1952. The story was simple. A marshal, abandoned by his town, must face outlaws alone. Cooper's performance was quiet, almost weary, but resolute. His walk down the empty street, clock ticking toward noon, became one of the most iconic images in cinema history. This was the gunfighter reimagined for the Cold War era. A man who stood his ground not for himself, but for the principles of justice, even when no one else would. It was less Texas saloon brawl, more allegory of democracy versus tyranny. The revolver had become moral symbol. Yet Hollywood didn't entirely sanitize the myth. By the late 1950s and 60s, cracks appeared. Directors like John Ford, who had helped create the heroic archetype, began to question it. Films like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, 1962, suggested that the gunfighter was not a hero, but a violent man whose time had passed, replaced by law and order. In this film, John Wayne's gunfighter kills the villain, but the credit goes to a politician, played by James Stewart. The message was clear. The West belonged to lawyers and legislators now, not men with six-shooters. But the myth, the legend of the gunfighter, was more powerful than the truth. As the film famously concluded, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." It was as if Hollywood was admitting what Texas had already known. The gunfighter was myth, but myth was what endured. By the late 1950s, the West on film was changing. For 2 decades, John Wayne had stood as the granite-faced symbol of the frontier. Brave, unwavering, moral. Gary Cooper had shown the lonely courage of a man who stood for justice even when abandoned. These were gunfighters reimagined for a modern nation, guardians of law, not gamblers and outlaws. But America itself was changing. The Cold War, civil rights struggles, and disillusionment with authority seeped into culture. Audiences no longer wanted heroes without shadows. They wanted complexity, men who were flawed, violent, morally uncertain. And into that space rode Clint Eastwood. In the early 1960s, Italian directors, most famously Sergio Leone, began making what came to be called spaghetti westerns. Shot in the deserts of Spain, these films reimagined the American frontier with grit and cynicism. Eastwood, a relatively unknown actor at the time, starred in A Fistful of Dollars, 1964, For a Few Dollars More, 1965, and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, 1966. His character, the man with no name, was not noble or moral. He was laconic, ruthless when necessary, willing to kill for money, yet possessing an odd sense of justice buried beneath the dust. This was the gunfighter stripped to his core. A man defined not by law or loyalty, but by survival and skill with a pistol. The spaghetti westerns were shocking compared to Hollywood's polished versions. Gunfights were brutal, often unfair. Heroes were morally gray. Outlaws could be sympathetic. Lawmen could be corrupt. And yet, audiences loved it. Leone's wide shots of desolate landscapes, punctuated by sudden, explosive violence, captured something essential about the gunfighter myth. Its rawness, its ambiguity, its refusal to be contained by morality. The Man with No Name was, in many ways, closer to John Wesley Hardin or Kingfisher than to John Wayne's Ringo Kid. He was dangerous, unpredictable, yet magnetic. Hollywood responded with its own darker westerns. Films like The Wild Bunch, 1969, showed aging outlaws facing the end of their world with savage violence. Others, like Once Upon a Time in the West 1968, treated the gunfighter as a fading ghost, doomed to vanish before railroads and progress. The shift was complete. The gunfighter was no longer just hero or villain. He was both and neither. Yet through it all, one thing remained constant: the six-shooter as symbol. Whether it was Gary Cooper standing tall at high noon, John Wayne holding the line against bandits, or Clint Eastwood squinting under his hat before a lightning-fast draw, the revolver remained the heart of the image. It was the equalizer, the tool that made one man stand against many, the artifact that carried Texas's culture of violence into cinema and myth. And while the real Texas gunfighters had lived short, brutal lives, their cinematic heirs strode eternal across the screen. By the end of the 1960s, the Western was one of the most dominant genres in the world. From Los Angeles to Rome to Tokyo, audiences thrilled to the image of the lone gunfighter. He had been reborn 100 times. Gambler, sheriff, outlaw, knight, ghost. The frontier was long gone. But in the world's imagination, it had never ended. By the late 1960s, the gunfighter was everywhere. John Wayne's broad-shouldered hero stood tall in American cinemas, while Clint Eastwood's squinting anti-hero prowled across Italian deserts. But the world itself was changing. The Vietnam War shattered faith in noble violence. The civil rights movement challenged old myths of America. Audiences, weary of clean heroes and simple morality, wanted something rawer, something closer to truth. And so the Western itself changed. The revisionist Western was born. Unlike the polished films of John Ford or the operatic spaghetti westerns of Sergio Leone, revisionist westerns asked, what if the gunfighter was not a hero at all? What if he was simply a killer? These films stripped away legend and forced audiences to confront the brutality beneath the myth. One of the earliest and most striking examples was The Wild Bunch, 1969, directed by Sam Peckinpah. Here, the gunfighters were not noble lawmen but aging outlaws, weary, brutal, clinging to a world that no longer existed. They slaughtered enemies in slow-motion bloodbaths, not for justice, but for survival. Audiences had never seen such violence on screen before. The film shocked some, thrilled others, but left no doubt. The age of the Western had entered a new phase. The Wild Bunch asked not who was right, but whether anyone was. In the 1970s and 80s, more films followed this path. Clint Eastwood himself, once the face of Leone's anti-hero, began directing films that interrogated the myth. And then, in 1992, came Unforgiven. Unforgiven was unlike any Western before it. Eastwood, older now, played William Money, a retired killer turned farmer. Once, he had been the deadliest gunfighter alive, a man who killed women, children, anyone who stood in his way. Now, he struggled to leave that life behind. But when poverty and revenge dragged him back into violence, Money showed the truth of the gunfighter. Not noble, not glamorous, but horrifying. His final rampage in a saloon was not a duel, not a clean showdown, but a massacre, brutal, chaotic, merciless. The film was both homage and eulogy. It honored the legend of the gunfighter while destroying it, revealing the blood and trauma hidden beneath decades of myth. And then there was Lonesome Dove, 1989. Not a film, but a television miniseries that captured the imagination of millions. Based on Larry McMurtry's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, it followed retired Texas Rangers Gus McCrae and Woodrow Call on a cattle drive north. It was not about outlaws or shootouts, but about friendship, aging, and the slow passage of a world once defined by violence. The Rangers, who had once fought Comanche and Feuds, were now relics, respected, even admired, but living ghosts of another time. For Texans especially, Lonesome Dove was more than a story. It was an elegy for the culture that had bred Hardin, Thompson, and the Rangers. The gunfighter was remembered with affection, but also with sadness. And in 1993, Hollywood returned to Tombstone with fresh eyes. Kurt Russell as Wyatt Earp and Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday brought a new depth to the old tale. Yes, the OK Corral shootout was staged with drama and flair, but the film also lingered on disease, loneliness, betrayal, and the psychological cost of living by the gun. Holliday, in particular, was transformed from a one-dimensional gambler into a tragic, charismatic figure. Coughing blood, laughing at death, loyal to the end. Tombstone proved that the myth could survive revision. The gunfighter could be flawed, broken, even doomed, and still captivate audiences. The revisionist Western was more than a change in cinema. It was a mirror held up to America itself. By the 1970s, audiences no longer believed in spotless heroes. They had seen too much. Assassinations, wars broadcast on television, scandals at the highest levels of government. The old John Wayne archetype, the square-jawed defender of order, felt like a relic. The gunfighter, once a symbol of freedom, was recast as something darker. A killer shaped by violence, scarred by it, and trapped by it. Films like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, 1971, painted the West not as a land of noble duels, but as a bleak world of exploitation and corruption. In it, gunmen were not heroes but mercenaries, serving whoever paid them. Others like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973, portrayed the legendary outlaw not as a romantic rebel, but as a doomed young man crushed by the forces of change. Even Pat Garrett, once the sheriff hero, was shown as weary and compromised, a man selling out old friends for survival. The message was clear. The gunfighter was no longer mythic. He was tragic. Yet Texas, as always, remained at the center. When Larry McMurtry wrote Lonesome Dove, he wasn't interested in saloon duels or outlaw myths. He wanted to capture the Texas Rangers he had grown up hearing about. Men who had lived through Comanche wars and cattle drives, now older, watching the world change around them. Gus McCrae and Woodrow Call were not flawless heroes. They were stubborn, contradictory, sometimes foolish. And yet, their friendship and endurance gave them a dignity that outshone any dime novel myth. Lonesome Dove was revisionist in the truest sense. It stripped away the polish, but it didn't mock the past. Instead, it honored it while showing its cost. For Texans especially, it felt like coming home to a story that was theirs, one that admitted the violence but also the humanity of the men who had lived it. In the 1990s, Tombstone and Unforgiven together defined the two poles of the revisionist Western. Tombstone gave audiences what they loved: action, gunfights, loyalty, sacrifice, but layered it with realism. Doc Holliday coughing blood between duels, Wyatt haunted by loss, villains who weren't just faceless bad guys, but men driven by pride and desperation. Unforgiven, by contrast, stripped the myth bare. William Money was no Earp or Hickok. He was closer to Hardin, a man who had killed women and children, a man who tried to bury his past but could never escape it. His final rampage was not heroic but terrifying. Together, these films told a truth that Texans had always known. The gunfighter was legend and warning, hero and killer, admired and feared. By the end of the 20th century, the revisionist Western had done its work. It had dismantled the clean myth created by dime novels, Wild West shows, and John Wayne films. It had reminded audiences that the men behind the stories were often broken, violent, and doomed. But it had also confirmed something deeper. Even when stripped of polish, the gunfighter remained compelling. America and the world could not look away. The Texas gunfighter had been reborn once again, not as a knight in white, but as a ghost in gray. The guns are silent now. The cattle trails are gone, the feuds are dust, the Rangers ride modern highways instead of prairie trails. The men who once lived by the six-shooter are long dead. Hardin in an El Paso saloon, Jesse James on the floor of his own home, Billy the Kid in a darkened room, Ben Thompson ambushed, Kingfisher riddled with bullets, Hickok shot in the back. And yet, they live. Not in the way they lived, but in the way they are remembered. The gunfighter did not end with the frontier. He became something more. A symbol, a legend, an eternal story told and retold across generations. In novels, he is the tragic outlaw, the noble marshal, the gambler with steel nerves. In film, he is John Wayne's stoic knight, Clint Eastwood's ruthless anti-hero, or Val Kilmer's charismatic Doc Holliday. In video games, he rides again in worlds like Red Dead Redemption, where players step into the boots of outlaws and lawmen, walking the same blurred line between hero and villain. The details change, but the core remains. A man, his weapon, and his willingness to stand alone. And always at the root of it is Texas. It was in Texas that the six-shooter first became a way of life, where cattle trails gave rise to feuds, where the Rangers learned their craft, where John Wesley Hardin, Ben Thompson, and Kingfisher carved their bloody reputations. It was from Texas that cowboys rode north to Kansas, carrying their pistols and tempers into Dodge City and Wichita. It was Texas blood that spilled in the Sutton-Taylor feud, Texas courage that fueled the Rangers, Texas recklessness that inspired dime novels. Even when the stories moved to Tombstone, to Missouri, to New Mexico, the Texan influence remained. The Gunfighter was, in truth, a Texan export, carried into the wider West by the men who lived and killed there. The myth spread far beyond America. In Germany, Karl May's novels filled shelves with Texas tales. In Japan, samurai fans found a mirror in the stoic Gunfighter. In Europe, Buffalo Bill's shows drew crowds of thousands. And Hollywood carried it all into the 20th century, so that by the 1950s, the Gunfighter was not just American, he was global. Even today, in places far removed from the plains of Texas, people know the image. The lone rider, the dusty street, the hand hovering over the revolver. But what is it about the Gunfighter that endures? It is not the killing. Hardin's cruelty, Allison's madness, or the feuds of DeWitt County are not admired. It is not the law, for the Gunfighter was as often outlaw as martial. It is the idea that one person, by courage and will, can shape their fate. That in a chaotic world, where law and order falter, a single individual can rise, defiant, armed only with skill and nerve. That idea is timeless. The Gunfighter lives on, not in dusty saloons or cattle towns, but in stories. In the movies, he never left. Unforgiven, Tombstone, 310 to Yuma, Open Range. Each generation rediscovers him, reshaping him for its own fears and hopes. Sometimes he is hero, sometimes villain, often both. In literature, the Gunfighter thrives. Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian strips away the myth, painting him as an agent of chaos and death. Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove turns him into a weary old ranger, riding one last trail. Even in science fiction and fantasy, echoes appear, lone wanderers with pistols or swords, cut from the same cloth as Hickok or Hardin. In video games, he is resurrected for millions to embody. In Red Dead Redemption, players live the life of an outlaw in Texas-inspired landscapes, making choices of honor or cruelty, just as the real men once did. Even in politics and culture, the image lingers. Leaders are praised as straight shooters. Debates invoke the Wild West to describe lawless frontiers of economics, technology, or cyberspace. The Gunfighter remains shorthand for toughness, independence, and danger. But he is not only inspiration. He is also a warning. The real men behind the myth, Hardin, Allison, Thompson, lived short, violent lives. They left behind grief, widows, and blood in the dust. Their courage was often cruelty, their honor often stubbornness, their freedom bought at the cost of others' lives. The myth shines brighter than the truth, but the truth whispers beneath it. Violence may bring fame, but it rarely brings peace. And yet, the fascination remains. Why? Because the Gunfighter embodies a tension at the heart of America itself. Freedom versus order, law versus self-reliance, myth versus reality. He is the man who insists that one individual can matter, even when the world says otherwise. In Texas saloons, in Kansas cowtowns, in New Mexico canyons, in Arizona deserts, he walked a line so thin it could never last. And in dying, he became immortal. Today, the Gunfighter belongs not to Texas or the frontier, but to all who tell stories. He is John Wayne striding through Monument Valley. He is Clint Eastwood squinting under a wide-brimmed hat. He is Billy the Kid grinning in a dime novel, Jesse James robbing a train, Wyatt Earp walking toward the OK Corral, a Texas Ranger silhouetted against the sun. He is hero and villain, memory and myth, past and present. Above all, he is legend.